Committee Room 21. Signed. 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 Committee Room 21, 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 signed. Committee Room 21. 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 Signed. Committee Room 21, 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 signed. Committee Room 21. Sound. 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 Committee.
Members, as always, any supplementary or probing questions, just indicate as early as possible.
It's not just the final one.
It just goes from there to from the rooms up and all the doors.
Escalates quickly.
How's it going?
Yeah.
Okay, as witnesses and members of the public are settling, can I welcome members to the 10th meeting of the Public Accounts Committee in this 22-27 mandate, and advise members of the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast through Parliament buildings and online. However, there could be a slight delay in moving to any private session or back into public sessions, so please be patient with the system. Can advise that those in the public gallery are welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode, and that all devices are muted. They can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi. The password details are on the gallery rules, and it is not permitted to take photographs or record any of today's proceedings. We'll move on, members. Clerk, any apologies?
Just from David Honeyford.
Okay, and we'll just take this opportunity to wish David Honeyford a very happy birthday from the committee. Okay, members, we'll move on to draft minutes of the meeting of 9th of May at page 6 to 12 of your pack. I wasn't here as members content.
Yep.
Okay, there are no matters arising. Members, just under Chairperson's business, can I refer you to correspondence from the CIPFA, Northern Ireland Branch Committee, inviting me as the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee to provide an opening keynote address at their Northern Ireland Annual Conference, which will be held on the 15th of October at the Hilton Hotel in Belfast. The branch would like to hear about the committee's priorities and the role in achieving effective scrutiny and public accountability. Members, if agreed, I will attend that as Chair of this committee. Is that okay?
Great.
Okay, thank you, members. Okay, members, is there any relevant declaration of interest to declare? Okay, all good, thank you. Okay, members, correspondence at page 17 of your packs is correspondence dated the 9th of May 24 from Neil Gibson, the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Finance, advising of an additional witness for the evidence session on public sector procurement in Northern Ireland. It is Mr. Michael Watson, the Director of Construction and Procurement Delivery for the Department of Finance. You're very welcome. Can I ask members that are content to note the correspondence as received? Okay, can I inform members at page 5 of the tabled pack there's correspondence from the Federation of Small Business offering to provide evidence to the Public Procurement Inquiry, focusing on the payment performance of government in relation to procurement. The FSB believe it is an important facet of the wider procurement landscape and therefore hope it would be of value to the inquiry. Members, at this point I would agree with that, and I certainly think it would be informative and beneficial for us to have them with us at the committee. There is a working paper from 22 attached to the correspondence which is currently being updated. So members agreed?
Agreed.
Okay. And members will look at this again at the forward work programme under agenda item 9. Can I inform members that page 19 of your packs is correspondence dated the 10th of May 24 from new script for mental health, providing a written submission to the Inquiry in Mental Health Services in Northern Ireland. I know there's a number of interesting things within it, members, but at this point, if you are content to note, and we'll forward it to the Northern Ireland Audit Office for consideration in the final report.
Great.
Okay, can I refer members to correspondence at table packet page 35 to 46 from Dr. Deirdre Meehan on behalf of the Chairperson Association of Child Psychotherapists in relation to the Committee's inquiry into mental health. The association is responsible for regulating the training and practice standards of child and adolescent psychotherapists and wishes to highlight the huge gap between the CAPT services in Northern Ireland, CAMS. Dr. Meehan has asked that the issues raised in the submission are considered in relation to the Committee's inquiry with regard to the provision of a child and adolescent psychotherapist service. Can I seek agreement that the issues raised in the submission are considered as part of the Committee's inquiry into mental health? And can I ask if members are content to forward the submission to the Northern Ireland Audit Office for consideration in the final report? All agreed, members?
Great.
Thank you. Okay, members, we now move on to the inquiry on public procurement in Northern Ireland evidence session, a very important session for this committee and indeed for this assembly. Can I welcome to the meeting Mr. Neil Gibson, the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Finance. You're very welcome, Mr. Gibson. Ms. Sharon Smith, Chief Executive, Construction and Procurement Delivery for the Department of Finance. Ms. Smith, you're also very welcome. Mr. Michael Watson, Director of Construction and Procurement Delivery, Department of Finance. You're also very welcome, Mr. Watson, and thank you for notifying the committee in advance in terms of the witness. We also welcome back Mr. Stuart Stevenson, Treasury Officer of Accounts, and Ms. Dorina Carville, Comptroller and Auditor General for Northern Ireland. Members, in your packs are the relevant papers at pages 32 to 40 of your papers. Mr. Gibson, Ms. Smith, Mr. Watson, welcome to the Public Accounts Committee and thank you for taking the time to meet with this committee today. I will ask you to make an opening statement and then we will open the session to members. Thank you, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for the opportunity to be here and provide evidence in response to the NIAO report on public procurement. You will all be very aware of the importance of procurement to the delivery of our services and indeed to the health and vibrancy of our economies and societies. I'm delighted, you've already mentioned the panel members, I'm delighted to be joined by Sharon and Michael, and I hope that over this session you will share my view, which is that we are in very good hands in terms of the quality of people that we have leading our procurement services and the journey of improvement that we are on and the things that lie ahead for us. I wouldn't want to swap the team that I have for anyone in terms of delivering against that, so my thanks to both of them and their staff. We know from the report published and from the data that we hold, we're talking about £3 billion of spending here, which is a very significant sum. So it's absolutely right that we provide and that you scrutinise and look at and query how we account for that spending. Looking at the data, that £3 billion obviously delivers the goods and services that alongside our people are the bedrock of the services that our businesses and our citizens rely on every day. About roughly 80% of that spending goes to SMEs. About 2/3 of that spending goes to organisations who have their declared office based within Northern Ireland. So in addition to being the provider of services that we rely on, it's also in and of itself an important economic and social development vehicle, providing a lot of business opportunities throughout Northern Ireland. We were very much welcoming of the NIAO's report, and my thanks to Dorina and to her team. We accepted all of the recommendations in full, and during our conversation today, hopefully you will see the things that we've put in place to meet those recommendations. It's actually going to be a very pivotal year for procurement in Northern Ireland. We have the obvious and very welcome return of the executive, so a new set of priorities. We should have a programme for government, an investment strategy against which we can refresh our policy and procurement policy and strategic direction. We're going to have the new Procurement Act coming into force in October. That's again going to be a pivotal moment for procurement, and indeed some of the changes in that are designed to meet some of the criticisms that there are of procurement around bureaucracy, paperwork and complexity. So with those, if you like, factors of change, our new Minister in post, who, although as you can understand has had a fairly full slate with budget matters, has already had important engagement with stakeholders in the procurement space and has set out her importance that she places on procurement, and the fact that this new set of the new Act coming into force, the new strategic direction for the returning executive, will give her the opportunity to bring a new refreshed policy and strategy direction to take to the executive and to deliver continued improvement in procurement. But during our question session, I look forward to explaining a little bit more about some of those actions and how they will take us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. There's nothing that Mr. Watson or Ms. Smith wants to add at this point? No,
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll begin and then we'll pass out to a few members of the committee. Mr. Gibson, the report highlights the generally negative perception of public procurement that exists. We hear about it almost on a weekly occurrence. However, it also notes the frustration of procurement practitioners that this perception is unfair. Do you think the public have and should have confidence in public bodies' ability to effectively manage procurement?
I do, yes. I think when I look at the overall evidence, and we will come back to the fact that we could do with better and more precise evidence, but I think when we look at that level of expenditure, and I compare that to the data that I do have in terms of either they be legal challenges or the queries that come in from members or individuals, undoubtedly in the scale of expenditure there are ways in which we could improve. But when I look at my accounting officer's responsibilities for the areas of procurement that I have responsibility for, I think we should have confidence in that delivery. And whilst not in any way querying that critique, it's also important to think about procurement and how it often gets wrapped up into other issues about affordability or planning, and can be quite complex to work out what specifically is the area of improvement in procurement that we would need. But I accept we have plenty of progress to make. But as an accounting officer and a person responsible for procurement for CPD division, I would be confident, or I would say that the public should be confident in our ability to deliver.
And what specifically is the improvements that's needed in relation to procurement, as you've just touched on?
Well, some of them are very clearly set out in the report, which is very helpful and points to areas of, and some of these will be familiar to other areas, not just procurement. So around skills and capability, it's a very competitive market to get the talent that's required to deliver services. It requires a significant level of skill and training, and retaining staff and attracting staff is certainly an issue. There are question marks around the specificity and detail of data that we hold, which is obviously a critical piece of any assessment of whether a service is performing. And there are other aspects around strategy and governance. Are we absolutely sure that in 2024 we have a clear direction of what we want our procurement to actually deliver? And that's one of the Minister's key priorities, is to refresh that strategic direction now that the Executive's back.
Okay, and just to touch on another point, some of the key projects that are outstanding for prolonged protracted periods of time have exceeded all expectation in terms of costs. What can be done better to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, we have, and again, this can bleed into other areas, and I believe you'll have the pleasure or mispleasure of having us back again later in the year on capital projects. So quite often the issues can pertain to aspects that are outside of the remit of procurement. So we've lived through a very high cost of living era. We've seen very significant energy price increases. We've seen very significant increases in labour costs, for example. So there are lots of reasons, and we see across the world, we do a lot of trying to learn from other jurisdictions, that cost of project delivery is very significant. For me, all that does is heighten the importance that we're as efficient and as effective in procurement as we can be, as we don't want any other obstacle to add to those other pressures that we see around there in terms of cost inflation. Some of the biggest projects are getting increasingly complex, and we're seeing that throughout the world. So it becomes a really important piece for us, again, drawing on the guidance from the Audit Office in their innovation report, that we make sure we learn from jurisdictions that are much bigger than our own. And we certainly do that through our stakeholder engagement, because this is a very common problem at the moment, being able to deliver complex projects. I think we're seeing, for me, one of the biggest changes that's probably something that's more germane today than it ever has been, is the way technology is changing. Is many projects now are beginning to even change within the duration of the gestation of the project. The technology that might have worked at the beginning, or the materials, have been supplanted or replaced during the course of that procurement phase. So it's becoming a greater and ever greater need to be as nimble and agile as you can, and certainly the new Procurement Act points in that direction, with attempts to try and ease a little bit of the sort of bureaucratic pressure, if you will, and striking, I'm sure this will come up a lot in this session, striking that balance between asking for only what you need but having enough that you can provide the evidence and assess performance is one of the big challenges for the procurement industry at the moment.
Okay, I appreciate that you've said that you've accepted all the recommendations made within our Audit Office report. It is a very good report, but you've also used two words: effectiveness and efficiency. Do you believe that to date, prior to the implementation of some of these new recommendations, that the handling of procurement in Northern Ireland has been effective and efficient?
I think on balance, and I mean, I think I could easily point to areas where we've come below the standard that one would hope for, and obviously there's an asymmetry in that. We tend to hear about those areas more than we do those that have gone well. I wouldn't want to pick out specifics. We'd be picking out individuals, which probably wouldn't be fair. But I think when I look at the overall aggregate of that quantum of spending and the amount of businesses that are relying on that, if I put that quantum against the amount of, be it legal challenges or complaints that we get, I think that overall balance of evidence in my professional assessment is that we could say that we have a qualified, efficient and effective system, but it's always on a journey of improvement.
Yeah. Okay. In your role as accounting officer for the Department of Finance, how satisfied are you that the public procurement is consistently delivering value for money? And what examples can you give of that?
I think that's certainly an area in which we run into some complexities given the nature of the Northern Ireland system in which we operate. So as an accounting officer, I can speak to the two centres of procurement expertise that sit within my portfolio, but can't offer the same level of commentary to you and to this committee on the other centres of procurement which exist within other departments and under other accounting officers. And one of the key recommendations here is about the quality of data against which we can assess that. So there is an annual report, the next one's due shortly, on the centres of procurement, but I would accept that it doesn't provide the fullness of information that we would want to have in order to report fully on that and answer that question fully. And that's why that's a very important part of what would be our new strategic direction coming up in the autumn, which would provide a more specific and clear direction as to what information was required to be reported. Now clearly that's this is a conversation that has to take place with the executive, because I go back to my previous point, it can sound like a very simple thing to do in terms of recording data. Well, how much was the bid price, how much was the final price? But if you only have that and you don't know what was the cost inflation or wage inflation, it's not a full picture. But we get constant feedback from our stakeholders that we can be overly burdensome on the data that we request and ask for. So that will be a very important part of the work over the summer and into the autumn, about getting that proportionate level of measurement so that we can report and answer your question more effectively about the cross-system performance, rather than the bit that I can speak to about my own department. I don't know, Sharon, if you don't.
That would be very helpful. Thank you, Accounting Officer. I think from an efficiency point of view, it's to make sure the process is as slick as possible. And I think if there's any criticism in the report, it's about the risk averseness, and that can happen when you're trying to specify your goods and services, when you choose how to go out to competition. Competition will generally drive value for money. However, you have to be sure that you're actually procuring the right thing at the right time. In terms of the major capital projects, there's a huge piece of work, and I think this is the pivotal point where the investment strategy for Northern Ireland will have a new governance arrangements around it, and that's from the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board. There's a committee for the ISNI, was the subgroup on infrastructure, but we have very, very I think very strategically focused on the ISNI, how we're going to be delivering that over the next 10 years. I've just come from a meeting with the construction group on the skills deficit in Northern Ireland. We can't buy everything at the same time. Labour is probably our scarcest resource, and as you know, supply and demand, if you don't have a good supply, then prices will increase. On the major capital projects, SIB did a bit of research in terms of the inflationary pressures over the time that the Audit Office did their assessment, and they reckoned it was about 21% was solely contributed to construction inflation, which again, in terms of all the other external factors, I think there has to be a criticism that we are too slow. I think we have to find a better way to fail fast. I think that's particularly important in our major capital projects. In terms of the committee's role, we have the perm secs on that group that have the highest spending areas, portfolios. We have Education Authority, Health, Infrastructure, and we have SIB, and it's chaired by Patrick McGee, who's the non-member or the non-executive member on the NICS board. That gives us a real opportunity to be able to ensure that we have the enablers. One's procurement, as Neil mentioned, we have planning, we have project assurance and project management, making sure the skills, and we've seen other reports. I think what we've have in the major capital reports is a combination of reports with the capacity and capability from the NIAO and the PAC report. And I do think with the new regulations, with the ISNI committee, with the new programme for government, procurement has to be an enabler to make sure that we do deliver on the commitments that the programme for government will set for us. What the ISNI committee will do, will look at the investment over the next 10 years, get the players in the room, and this comes to the other criticism about silo behaviours, get everyone in the room who is contributing to the delivery of ISNI, and we will work through cooperation, collaboration and coordination. And I think it's very evident from the report, and you mentioned the word consistency, Chair. I think that's where we're lacking. There is a lot of good work going on. I visited the Central Hub a few weeks ago. If you ever get the opportunity to visit that to me is a project that's working really well, and the community benefit that's happening in and around that hub as well. I think you have to see those on the ground working and see how hard people are actually there delivering. It hasn't been without its challenges, but they've worked through all of those challenges. I think they got their planning application through in 6 months, and that was because they had the right people there working through the planning system to make sure they navigated it well. So we do need to improve, we do need to be more efficient, and I think it is, I do welcome the report because that gives us an opportunity to look at the governance arrangements once we've set up our strategic objectives, because we are doing this programme for government, strategic objectives for procurement to deliver on that programme for government. And then how do you monitor and govern that? And I think the report was very clear in terms of the current structures and the procurement board. And I think we do need to work our way through that to see whether a board and it's, how it's governed. And that's obviously the recommendation that we have accepted about the review. So we do certainly welcome this report, and we certainly see it as a way forward for us.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer to that, but some of the challenges that we face around procurement in Northern Ireland well, they've been there for a significant number of years. So why has it taken for the Northern Ireland Audit Office to point to these in a report for any action to be taken to deal with it? Because multiple various sectors and stakeholders have been calling out for action on this for years. So why is it only happening now as a result of this report?
Well, I would argue there has been significant improvement against many of those criticisms over the years. A good example of that would be we used to have a more complicated policy environment. We now have 5 policy notices. There used to be 40 policy guideline notes, and there was a strong indication that was a complex landscape. That's been decluttered. That's moving faster. I have a much smaller team delivering them previously, which reflects an efficiency and effectiveness direction from ourselves. And we have, be it in terms of payment targets, be it in terms of the money that's being spent, we continue to see projects delivered in a way that I suppose I feel always a little bit uncomfortable, because we have a greater visibility if something's run into a problem, and so many of them run so smoothly. I certainly see that. We had the Audit Office take a look at one of our own COPs in detail, and there were no major findings there that suggested that we were falling short of any standards. But we're also working within your team, Michael, to drive consistent and considered, albeit a very small team, considered improvements. You might want to speak to some of those.
Yeah, I mean, if I come back to your question on value for money, it's a really good question. And in procurement, there are two parts to that question. Public procurement under law requires us to invite tender offers from a range of suppliers, and we set out a criteria to try to identify best value for money. And we make a decision on that evaluation criteria to award a contract. But the true test of value for money is, can we get that contract delivered for the price that we agreed and the content of what we agreed on? The new Procurement Act is going to make a significant change to test this. Okay, for the first time ever, procurement law will go beyond the tendering process. So the Procurement Act actually redefines the procurement life cycle to say it's everything about pre-market engagement and preparation for going to tender, and then there's a requirement to deliver that contract. And where I think we will get an improvement in this test of value for money is the new Act will set a transparency requirement on all contracting authorities to set KPIs for the performance of that contract when they award it, and to report at least annually on the progress of those KPIs. It's widely recognised across the jurisdictions involved in the Act, South Wales and England, that those KPIs are likely to focus on time, cost and quality, and I think that's the true test for value for money. But by introducing the transparency, it's not just for the contracting authority, it's for civil society to actually see that we are delivering value for money. But the true test of value for money is actually delivering the contract that we entered into for what we agreed at the point that we awarded it.
It doesn't happen that often, Mr. Watson, does it?
I think the recommendation in the report regarding data is a very good report. What we tend to focus on, we have focused on for over 20 years in public procurement, is around the volume of contracts that we award each year, which is procurement activity, and the value of those contracts when they're awarded. The missing piece is actually ensuring that those contracts do come in on cost. And it's very hard to get data on that, because the expenditure that's paid on those contracts is actually managed through an accounting system, not the procurement system. And trying to get an integrated point or a link or some kind of data from the accounting system that shows how much has been paid against the contract and whether it is on course for delivery, whether it's within its budget, and whether it's meeting its KPIs is the particular challenge that we face right now. But we're hoping that the Procurement Act will go some way to helping that, because there will be a requirement to publish some of this detail that we can actually gather from a new central digital portal that's been established for the Act.
Okay, you touched on a very brief, members, before you let you in. In relation to the value for money question that I had raised, Mr. Gibson, you'd made a statement to say it's the nature of the system in which we operate. Can you elaborate on what you exactly meant by that?
Well, as Michael's pointed out, there is a limited... The way that it's currently structured, and we have a number of COPs and centres of expertise much closer to their own area than would be possible if you had one central system, for example. So procurement's very different in health than it is in education, for example. But they each have their own structures. They have an accounting officer framework, be it within an education authority or within Northern Ireland Water, up into their own department. And that limits to some degree the visibility that any central body, whoever that might be, a procurement board or a CPD organisation or indeed a NICS board, would have to that information. That's not to say there isn't accountability and governance there. Each accounting officer has their responsibilities in respect to the value for money within their own department, but it does make it more difficult for me, for example, to come here and speak about value for money that's under others' purview. But we do, in the Department of Finance, have an additional role within the business case and the approvals process. So for much of the procurement that we've talked about, it can be relatively small and would be within delegated limits, and therefore we would have a relatively limited role, although we do set those delegated limits and the guidelines for that. But business cases would come to DOF for scrutiny that are outside those delegated limits, and any adjustment beyond and normally around about a 10% cost margin would have to come back for consideration again. So I don't want to give the impression there isn't a level of accountability and governance, but there certainly is a limit on the kind of aggregate data that you might expect to be able to see to allow us to maybe draw some cross-sectoral conclusions about what has been happening in terms of the across-the-piece procurement, rather than having to take it out of each individual accounting officer's assessment.
Okay, and what can be done to fix that particular problem, to ensure improvements?
Well, the key for this, like I said, I actually think this is a real critical year for that, because the new Procurement Act does bring new requirements. But equally, with a new strategic direction that the Minister hopes to bring for consideration to the Executive to sit alongside that, Within that, we can then look to new procurement notices, new governance structures to say what will be the transparency requirements that we want to see as a society, and then we can look to the appropriate governance models for that, be they boards or into NICS, and I'm sure we'll come up onto governance later, but it is really an important year for that because we will get the opportunity to set a new strategic direction in line with the new government principles, coincidentally with a new act as well that actually changes some of the requirements, and that potentially. We've also learnt a lot of lessons about how to do this well. We often think of designing new systems and data systems to record, and we get constant feedback that can be very onerous because you're duplicating effort. So we're trying to look at the most modern and effective ways of being able to draw data out, either automatically or create a more simplified and straightforward reporting framework. So there may be some, if you will, IT and operational improvements from what we might have done before, which has been, let's design a new system that everyone has to report into. We don't want to create any more burden on very busy organisations, but we think we should have potential to design a much better, under the new Act and new strategic guidelines, a much better way of saying this is what we require for the following purposes, here's how it will be reported, this is the way that it will be governed, and then the next time we would have a session like this, we would be able to sit with a more complete data picture to be able to discuss.
We hope. Just a final point before I move to Tom briefly and then on to the Deputy Chair, Cheryl Brownlee. You've touched on there that there's been lessons learned on a number of improvements, but you've also said at the same breath that there's issues with data. But have you data to substantiate your claim that there has been improvements in terms of procurement and also that we've seen lessons learned?
Yes, there are, and my colleagues will speak more about the specific nature of the data, but when you're in the accounting officer seat, there are some indications of improvements that you would see that include things like the extent to which you get specific complaints or issues. It may be about your payment, it may be about challenges to specific contracts, and whilst I do get them, I'm not saying I do not, there is a relatively small number of those relative to the amount of contracts issued. So that gives me a set of, if you like, at a helicopter level, a sense of some level of confidence. Then against specific projects, we have the value for money and the business case assessments, which also gives us a level of data. We have our reports on the COPs. We have another one coming here in a matter of weeks, actually, which again, not as detailed as anyone would like it to be, but it certainly does provide us with a snapshot and a picture. So against the number of people and complaints raised, alongside the delivery that we see every day, and then some of the aggregate data that we do collect through the COPs annual reporting cycle, we do have an incomplete, but I believe a sufficient picture to take a sort of aggregate view that procurement is delivering. I know we have data improvements on the way, but you might want to say a little bit about the COPs report that'll be coming shortly.
Yeah, we publish an annual report we gather data from all COPs. I should say we do have a system which is capable of recording this data, but we can't rely on its accuracy because sometimes it's completed, sometimes it's not, by the respective organisations. So each year we write out to the heads of procurement of each of the organisations, we ask them for a cleansed set of data. And that data will come in and it will give us an indication of roughly how many contracts they've awarded this year and what the total value of those contracts would be. However, I think the usefulness of that data has come to the end of its life because we often refer to using public procurement as an economic driver locally, and all jurisdictions are the same. The problem with data on contracts awarded is that contract may span over 5-10 years. So it's hard to tell actually how much money in each year is going to go through that contract. So what we would like to get to, and the Procurement Act will help us get there, is a sort of an indication of how much hard, cold cash is going through government contracts each year and back into the economy, how much is going to local companies, how much then can be attributed to creating jobs, helping social value and all those nice priorities that we want to pursue. At the minute, the data that we're getting on contracts awarded is telling us that we're roughly turning over a certain volume of about 5,000 contracts a year. And that would equate sometimes between 2.2 billion up to as high as 4 billion, depending on the nature of the contracts that have been awarded. So it's not a figure that you want to put too much emphasis on because it could be one particular year that a number of contracts come up for renewal that are particularly high value of hundreds of millions, but that hundreds of millions is spread over quite a number of years, 10, 15 years. So we want to, through the Procurement Act and the requirement to publish more data on the delivery of contract, to get to the position where we can see how much money has been put through the government contracts that are on the ground today.
Thanks. And just to add to that, each of the PPNs, the 5 of them, have their own monitoring and reporting framework. So were there to be a new strategic direction set, we would then also be putting in those requirements of reporting that would be needed, because I know we'll rightly have a focus on value for money today, but as Michael's alluded to, procurement can be a very important strategic tool for any jurisdiction around other priorities that it might have. Social value is the one that we've seen such a focus on rightly in the last 10 years, but you can think about environmental concerns as another area. So thinking about the policy of what it is you're trying to achieve with your procurement can be more than just lowest cost value for money considerations, and that all stems from the strategy that you set, which would be for the executive to set, but with this crystallising of a new Procurement Act and a new programme for government, that gives us the perfect time to bring in a new strategic direction and put in place the requirement to have the right monitoring against those different objectives: value for money, social impact, environmental impact, etc.
Okay, thank you. Tom, you wanted to briefly?
Just one thing, back, Michael, to the delivering or the agreeing of a contract. For every contract that you agree, do you believe that can be delivered for the amount of money that is agreed? And if not, do you have a sliding scale then as to what percentage you will allow that contract to go over the agreed price?
What I would say on that is the majority of contracts we award, we would absolutely expect them to come in on price. There will always be the more complex contract, not the complex procurement, but contracts become very complex, particularly around IT and construction, where things can change in the market during the course of the 4 or 5 years that you're delivering it. Technologies change, or the way we're trying to deliver, we may come across unforeseen circumstances. But you know, the desire of the new Procurement Act is to monitor how far we are away from that delivering to the contract, the agreed price that we've got. So we believe that the transparency in there will actually sharpen people's ideas and to make sure they get the contract delivered for the price. But I would say the majority of contracts, Sharon, you may want to add to that from the general perspective, would come in on the agreed price.
I suppose if you look at the major capital projects, the question is how many of those are going to meet what their outline business case was, and it was very clear that there was a big difference. I think overall there was an average of 44% that were different. And I think we are in a position where perhaps there was an over-optimism on the cost estimates. I think that's one of the conclusions from SIB when they've looked at the root causes of the major capital projects. I think we need to get better cost estimates, and that's the work that the ESNI committee will be doing. We also are, in the new regulations, there is an absolute, it's even stronger than an encouragement. It's about pre-market engagement, and as I say, meeting with the construction industry this morning, you should know what it's going to cost before you go to market, and there's probably not that level of benchmarking and the understanding the prices in the market, what the price risk differential is. So there's a huge amount of work going on in that area with the construction sector and with public sector. We meet regularly. I think we meet every few months. The other things on one of the questions about, you know, how do you get consistency is we have heads of procurement group meetings every few months, and that's where we come together and share information about where the risks are in each of our sectors and what we should be looking at. So cost estimates is your first start. If you get a good cost estimate, then your bids come in. There was, for many years, I think over a decade, we had abnormally low tenders, and there was a risk of bidders coming in too low and then not being able to deliver the contract, and that's where the tension comes in. I don't think we can see that as much. Certainly the construction industry would say that during COVID, a lot of businesses actually went out of business, and there is very few companies who will bid low because the risk of them not being able to sustain that. So I do think we're in a far better position, but I do think with the new Procurement Act and because people are busy, people want to go out to competition, and it's not always the best thing to do to move quickly at that stage. The more work you build in at the front end, the better your specifications are, the better your cost estimates are, the more competition you will drive, and therefore that should make it a smoother path. So you should be seeing more contracts to deliver on time. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Tom, I think a very important part of this to reflect on as well, and it's I say this advisedly, but is to think about the word contract. And we have to think about in that's what it is. We're contracting with someone, but there should be a level of trust and a relationship that needs to be built into that. So whilst making sure we absolutely focus on value for money, it's the public's expenditure, We do need to, and we've been doing a lot more to get better and closer stakeholder relationships, because companies have gone through a very challenging time with the wage inflation and price inflation. And that's something we have to be cognizant of, that, in contracts that have been procured over multiple years. We need to make sure we have a very strong and trusting relationship with our construction industry. Yes, challenging and driving every pound of value, but also recognising the world changes very quickly. And for so many of those companies, we can end up in a very fractious relationship if it's a rigid, that's your price, that's your number. Yes, your inflation's been 20%, but nothing we can do. So I think we need to, and we are maturing in the way that we look at open book and different ways of contracting to try and help us understand the fact that it's not as simple as saying this price is the following and 4 years later, sorry, that's still the price. But that requires a very high trust relationship, but also a level of transparency and reporting on, well, what have those changes been as a result of, and can we be confident that that's why the contract therefore can't be met. I think if we go too much into so for example, if I, from a leadership point of view, assess the performance of my colleagues and teams on how many did you get in on target, I'm not absolutely convinced that would give the best result for the economy and society if we weren't cognizant of trying to understand what those cost pressures were and working. If you've moved, Sharon spoke about it, if you move to that relationship of a better level of trust and understanding, then you get a more honest conversation at the beginning about what things will cost, as opposed to that bid low and then not be able to deliver. But we do, and I think it'll be our assessment qualitatively only, we see a lot less of that now here in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Tom, you okay?
Okay, thank
Cal,
you.
briefly, and then
Just
Diane.
quickly, thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for your answers so far. It strikes me as you speak, Neil, I mean, certainly public spend is about the economic drivers as well, so I appreciate that. My question from listening to the answers is this: I mean, we have to close that because there's so many measures, the value for money in the business case and procurement, so we have to marry that all up and deliver, right? And it is about public spend, but the problem is public spend, when you start a contract, it's like, it seems when you're in a public contract, the people out there, it's open door, what I mean, and we have to get away from that. But my point is, will this new piece of legislation you're saying close some of those gaps?
Yes, and Michael's closer to it than me and will speak to it, but I think it will, in combination with a clearer strategic direction as to what the executive wants out of procurement, what's the balance of social, economic, environmental impact as well as value for money concerns. That plus the Act, critically around that transparency of information, that's certainly been the focus in the UK deliberations around this Act, has been to give more confidence as to what's been procured, for what price and what's been delivered. I think, as Michael's alluded to, the key for us is to be able to just tell the story of what's been delivered as well as what's been procured, and that requires a more holistic view of the procurement pipeline. And I think the Act really presents the opportunity. But come back to the point I made before, it's important that we engage fully with our stakeholders in that, because any more transparency and information, there's an instant fear of, is it another reporting layer, another set of, so we want to make sure that we bring in appropriate governance and reporting, but that level of transparency and openness, and I do think the combination of the Act, new strategic direction, and a policy note that would go alongside that presents a real opportunity to answer that.
Thank you, Neil. We'll move on to Diane, but just you've touched quite a bit on trust. I wish I had your faith. This is a big money business, and there's quite a lot of things going on that shouldn't be. So, in God we trust, and others we pay cash. So that's just to remind, that there's a big problem here, and we need to be reminded of it. Diane?
Thank you, and thank you all for your answers so far. I just wanted to come in for a point of clarity, because I just feel that there's a bit of inconsistency in the answers around attitude to risk. So Neil, you had said that with regard to a lot of this, the complexity and the delays and things is because we tend to be quite risk averse. Yet in Sharon's answer to Tom, you're saying the outline business cases are very optimistic. So being quite significantly undervalued in outline business case, they're going really over budget. So it feels like in capital projects, you're saying you're quite risk taking. The outline business cases are really far away, yet in the service delivery procurement, you're quite risk averse. So I just wanted to ask for a bit of clarity around those two different answers that you have given.
Yes, and that both can be true in the sense that when you're in that conceptual phase and people are thinking about what needs built and delivered, there can be, and that's why it's an outline business case, you don't have all the details, so you would be maybe, what's common is you look at, and I'm speaking on behalf of those who put the cases together, but you very often look at what's happened in the past as a good predictor, and we've seen in the recent times that that's not the case. The inflation has been so rampant that your previous expectations of what something might cost may not have been a good indicator. So it may not have been an overly optimistic assessment. It may well have been one that was simply based on information that has long been superseded. But in terms of the risk aversion, it remains the case that there are so many pieces of public service that a procurement of a major project particularly would touch, that there are lots of stages of governance amongst that, whether that's around compiling the business case, whether it's around the procurement process itself, whether it's around the gateway reviews or assessing project delivery. And there can be a sense in which, if we layer on too much of that, that there's a fear that each and every hurdle requires more bureaucracy, more paperwork, and therefore the safest thing to not run into any trouble is to not do anything in the first place. And we always have to be mindful of that. And that's why the new Act and anything we would bring in, going down from 40 guidance notices to 5 procurement, everything has to be proportionate. So we are certainly doing our best on risk aversion. But, and again, it's in the Audit Office's report on innovation, a lot of that comes from leadership. So you rightly touched on the point of trust, and I have to balance that component with the absolute probity around public finances. But we have to have an ambitious and a high trusting relationship to really try and drive things forward. So leadership is a very important component of tackling as any risk aversion, and me empowering my team and their work on developing a new strategy. We've had very productive meetings with our Minister, who's been very engaged with the idea of, yes, let's get on with it and let's do that. That requires a little bit of risk taking. The easiest thing would be we'll consult about that for a few years. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the fact that both can be kind of true, that risk aversion coupled with an ambition from those putting together the cases.
And you noted before, we'll be coming as a committee to look at the major capital projects later in the year, but I think it's important to reflect on the both hand in hand, that a lot of the discussion around this particular report on the recurrent spend is about delays because of the complexity and the detailed governance, and yet we're looking at capital projects where it feels like there's less detailed complexity of governance, but absolutely huge overspend. So I just want to make that point now, and we'll look at the 2 reports obviously through the committee.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Neil. Neil, in terms of, you've touched on strategic leadership, but procurement is carried out and managed across a complex network of public bodies and COPs, as you've already indicated earlier. Who's responsible for delivering the strategic leadership to drive performance and coordinate behaviours across the various organisations?
Well, at the minute you would say some of that is almost a little bit in some areas ambiguous, because if you look at the procurement policy, any policy that sits that long probably isn't quite where you would want it to be today. So although there are very clear rules and responsibilities about the advice that we provide, the policy is set by the executive, procurement policy is set by the executive, and they have responsibility for that. But we in CPD provide that policy advice, help to craft those policies. There was a procurement board sitting, which is not currently in, and we may speak about that shortly. And again, that had previously a role, but the report was incredibly critical of whether it had actually provided the type of strategic policy direction that might be needed. Hence one of the reasons why it's not sitting presently until the Minister considers exactly what's the right structure going forward. And then there are the value for money for considerations under the accounting officer frameworks. So there is quite a mosaic there amongst different accounting officers with their own ministerial priorities and the capital programmes and the procurement that they need to deliver on, and that what their COPs look after for them. And then there's the central policy guidance that we provide and support and training that we provide as well. But again, and it sounds like I'm pinning all my hopes on this in the autumn, but so much rides on now a chance to clarify that position with a new strategy, a new strategic direction that the executive would agree on, reporting against that, and clear rules and responsibilities between ourselves, COPs, and indeed any future board that might be in place.
It looks like a mess, it sounds like a mess, it is a mess by the sounds of it, and it's certainly something that's led to considerable complex issues that need to be addressed. You've touched on the Public Procurement, or the Procurement Board, and it's assigned a range of responsibilities that would imply it has a key leadership role. Yet the Audit Office makes historic criticisms notes the historic criticisms of the board in terms of failure to address critical strategic issues that merited its attention. Do you agree that the board has historically failed to provide the leadership that was required in terms of procurement in Northern Ireland, and if so, why has it failed?
I would agree only in a limited sense, in that there is a criticism rightly about its role on the bigger strategic questions, but it did achieve many things in the last, for example, that move that I talked to from 40 guidance notices to 5 procurement notices. The board was instrumental in that. The progression of social value as an important component in Northern Ireland procurement, again, can be traced back to a lot of important work that the board did. But there is a very valid criticism about whether it looked at the overall strategic monitoring, strategic direction in the way that it might have done. There's also important points to consider in the report about what the makeup of that be. The board's had a number of guises, so it had accounting officers, permanent secretaries on it in the past, then restructured under a minister to have industry representation. And there are some points made in the report that need consideration about whether that presents any conflicts about its role. And that's one of the main reasons that the minister said, just to, if you like, I think, take a beat is the parlance of the day, just to make sure that we don't simply stand back up something that's come in for such criticism, and rather look at what exactly it is you want procurement to deliver, and then think about what the appropriate governance. Sharon has mentioned we have a new subcommittee of the NICS board, so clearly there is some consideration about what role it would or would not have. There's the idea of a procurement board itself and who should chair it, whether it should be independent, where it should sit. So that's something we're looking at as part of this consideration of what. But what's important to say, and Sharon can speak more to this, is most of the people, all of the people in fact who were on that, we've already had stakeholder engagement, you've been at meetings this morning. So the fact that policy can still be crafted now, which is happening, but can also go through that stakeholder. The relationships that have been built up through that board have not fallen because the board's not sitting. We have been keeping them fully appraised of what we're trying to do in terms of looking towards the new Act, the new strategic direction, and then making sure the governance and accountability is appropriate.
And Neil, I appreciate the emphasis on the new direction and the new strategy and everything else. I've asked you a specific question, though, in relation to the areas, the critical strategic issues that merited the attention of the board. Would you say that to date, before any changes are made, the board failed in those key areas?
I think it's a fair criticism, but I think to say that it would fail would do a disservice to the progress it made in areas like social value. So I don't think it would be fair to give it a carte blanche.
Could have done it better then? Is that a better?
Yes, I think that would be a better phraseology to say there are many areas in which we could have made more progress, but the board had a limited bandwidth and did make progress in a number of areas. I keep citing social value, but that would probably be one. But actually, getting down to 5 policy notices from 40 guidance notices is a big change to the system, and it would be wrong not to put that back to an achievement from the board.
Would it be fair to say, Neil, that the board to date has largely been reactive as opposed to proactive in terms of dealing with some of the real challenges that are so obvious in terms of procurement in Northern Ireland?
No, I don't think that would be fair on the basis that those issues that I talked about before, again, required a certain level of proactivity around things like social value. I don't think that would necessarily have been a reactive point. I think it's linked into the other points in the report that the limitations on some of the data that was there, and still is the case, meant that some of the other areas that they may have been expected to do more in, they wouldn't have had the information to do so. Sharon, you obviously have seen the iterations of the board and might want to add a bit more.
Yeah, certainly the post-2020 board, the proactivity there was very clearly, there was a clear leadership role on social value, supply chain resilience, which you may say was reactive, but we were making sure that going forward that you would not have the same potential supply chain issues that we saw through global pandemics, that our supply chains were really disrupted, which obviously led to an increase in prices. Over the previous iterations of board, I have looked back over since 2005, there were strategic frameworks set up. I think one of the things that hampered the board was there was a bit of a start-stop when the executive fell and it was a minister chairing. I looked over since 2014 to 2020, there were 12 procurement board meetings and 6 of those were chaired by a minister. And that's obviously because there were times when ministers weren't there or there were other things of priority that the minister was obviously occupied in. From 2020 to 2022, so December 2020 to September 2022, we had 9 procurement board meetings and 7 of those were chaired by a minister. And that's what delivered. We actually were astounded at the pace that we were able to deliver 5 policy notes. And the change, the pivot from 2020 was that those policy notes weren't agreed by a procurement board, they were actually signed off by an executive. The procurement board's role became almost advisory, and that was the minister was deciding, and that was clear leadership. There was a clear direction of travel, and that's what made the difference, Chair. And I do believe that if we were to set up a new procurement board, it would be on the basis of a very clear decision making from the executive, where policies went to the executive and they had the opportunity to agree that they were their strategic priorities, and then that means all departments have to fall in behind them. The 5 policy notes means that it's a ministerial opt-out, that every accounting officer or official has to go to their minister to opt out, which is not an easy thing to do, as exactly how the policies were written. The 40 PGNs, procurement guidance notes that were in place previously, had a mixture of policy, had some guidance. So I really do not criticise people for not being able to navigate their way through 40 guidance notes that they had to understand. It wasn't even profiled on the basis of, you're at this stage of the procurement, these guidance notes apply. It was really just, you have to apply everything at whatever point. So I wouldn't criticise anybody for having to navigate their way through it. What we have now is 5 clear policy executive objectives, and then 2 construction and sourcing toolkits. And that allows the flexibility. Some things that we're criticised here in our jurisdiction as opposed to others is that we are very prescriptive. We're all on the process, which means the outcome's not as important. So that flexibility of 2 toolkits that covers the end-to-end procurement life cycle for general sourcing and construction means that people can pick and choose what suits and what can be tailored to their needs. You talked about lessons learned, Chair, and some of the things, whilst we're not responsible for the likes of education procurement, and our Minister does get in front of them, that things in schools are more expensive than people would be able to buy themselves. So the Education Authority are actually setting up new frameworks that allows minor works to be procured locally in the schools. And those are some of the lessons that were learned, because collaboration, and we had a report in 2012 and then a PAC in 2014 about collaborative and aggregated demand. That is very useful up to a point, but when you centralise to the extent that then it impacts on locality and SMEs, that means there's actually a disincentive there to aggregate. I'll give you an example. Taxi services was one of the categories, transport was one of the categories we decided to collaborate on because it was a taxi service. But if you look at the educational requirement for taxi services, picking up children with potential special educational needs or other difficulties getting them to school, is completely different to picking up a civil servant from an office to take them somewhere else. We learned those lessons very, very quickly, and that has led us to 59 collaborative procurements, but not everybody's collaborating in each of them. And I do think that's where the system can flex, and I do think that's where the close working relationship with all other centres of procurement expertise is really key, to make sure that we are only collaborating and centralising to the extent that it actually makes a difference and it doesn't impact negatively on the local environment or the local community.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for your answers so far. Again, I want to touch on the board. Just in terms of the configuration of the board, do you believe it's appropriate, is the configuration of the board appropriate for it to deliver on its full range of responsibilities?
I actually think that has to come after what it is that you're asking your procurement to deliver, and that's one of the reasons, in consultation with the Minister, for not standing it up again in its previous guise, was when you know what you want your procurement to deliver and what way you then want to govern and accountability frameworks for that, helps you understand what structure would be best. As Sharon's alluded to, the progress that was made on the new procurement notices suggests that particular structure for that worked very well for that particular era of what needed done and bringing in social value. But what if the shape of the strategic direction looks a little bit different now? What if it's about transparency as a key focus of data? Then would it be appropriate to have those who are seeking to win contracts being in that board deciding on, or are they better as a stakeholder or an advisory forum? So I think that all has to be determined, but the correct direction of travel, I believe, and certainly my advice to my Minister has been, determine the strategic direction of what it is that you want procurement to achieve, and then think about the accountability and governance frameworks that will work for that. We've had it with the Minister, we've had it with accounting officers on it, and then we saw a great focus on these PPNs and social value. That worked very well. But what might the next era be? It might look a little bit different. But that's why we're committed to moving at pace to try, if we can, to coincide that progress on the new strategy alongside the new Act, because you certainly wouldn't want to be in a period of any extended time. Obviously we have been for political reasons, but you don't want to extend a process without the right governance accountability in place. But it was my view, and certainly the Minister shares it, or has indicated that she's supportive of that view, that it would be the wrong way round to stand up something that had been criticised in a report to do what? To stand against what actual strategic direction? Now, if I thought the strategic direction was going to take years, that wouldn't have been my advice, but I actually think we can move very swiftly at that. He says confidently as the man whose colleagues will be working hard on that.
No, I appreciate that. I suppose for me, whenever I read the NI Audit Report, one of the main things that jumped out to me was the composition of the board. So do you believe at the time there was potentially any bias in terms of policy making due to the configuration of that board?
I mean, looking back and thinking about the minutes I wouldn't say that on the basis of what I think was delivered. So again, I go back to social value, which was quite a challenging policy area to deliver in. Very different views from perhaps the construction industry to what it would have been from a policy perspective. But actually that worked rather well, and the sector came on board very well. Would that have worked as well if they hadn't have been represented on that board? I'm not so sure. That could have been maybe a more contentious policy development than it turned out to be. So again, thinking about what that board achieved in its time, I couldn't say, looking at it, that I could see or detect any sense of bias, or there's no data to point me in that direction. But I go back to the point that that may not be the net direction of travel that you want your next structure to do, because it had a very particular focus: declutter the policy landscape and progress social value. And it definitely achieved both of those. And I'm not sure, nothing I have seen would give me any suggestion. But I do think the composition of that board, whether it's board, advisory forum, how it segues with the NICS board, is a really important part of the conversation this summer and autumn.
No, definitely. But I suppose looking at the membership, did that technically mean that the heads of COPs were essentially monitoring their own performance? Would that be the right take on the board at that time?
Yes, and I think, as we were alluded to there, probably, and it's in the report, one of the critiques is that kind of assessment of performance was not something that was done to the level that we might hope and expect. Not fully a criticism of the board, because as we've alluded to, the data wasn't really there in the way that perhaps it should be. But rather than assess their own performance and give it a tick, what actually happened was they focused on other elements, which they did rather well. But I think in terms of the idea that you could mark your own homework, that would be absolutely a very strong concern and consideration you'd have to have for a make-up of any future board.
Yeah. And do you believe that was good governance? And also, what progress has been made to date to kind of, I know we're kind of in this limbo land almost, but what progress has been made to date to address that?
I think the most important comment on that is where I consider the greatest governance failure, if you like, is that kind of lapse in the strategic direction. Happened for all sorts of reasons that we could talk about, but we had a sort of forward work programme, but we still have documents there in terms of the policy framework that's being referred to in the report. It doesn't even have the right department name title on it, it's so old. So there is a sense there which I consider, and certainly that's been in my time, and that's what I put to the Minister as the first point on good governance, is know what it is you're trying to achieve. And that lapse in the strategic direction, in my view, allowed that board to focus on the issue of the time, and we have to think about the pandemic and why then sustainable, the sort of supply chain became an important issue. So I think it did what it had, but it probably falls into that more reactive space. I think it's really important that the real governance feeling that I think is there, and I would accept, is that lapse in the strategic policy framework against which you're actually trying to orientate yourself towards, and that's certainly first priority to try and clarify now.
Yeah, no problem. Just in terms of the strategy, I know that we've talked about it here slightly. Just what plans do you have for the introduction of this strategy, or where is it sitting at the moment?
Well, I'll let colleagues, this is it's got to be your favourite topic, Sharon. But we've been spending a lot of conversations about that, what will look in it, what principles, themes, transparency, what balance it will have, and should lead to very fruitful conversations with Minister and with stakeholders in time. But we're also trying to learn lessons from Audit Office's reports on well, let's see who else has done this. What is best practice at the moment? New guidelines have been coming out in England, for example. So we're hoping to, we can craft a fairly good, if you like, test case, if you like, straw man, straw person, in order to critique quite quickly, because there are a number of principles that you would you would find it hard to believe we wouldn't want to be here. Transparency is a very key one now across other jurisdictions. So we can get up to speed quite quickly in terms of, in other words, it's not a situation of us going out and say, what would you like to see in a strategy? We can put something up to kind of critique. So we think we can make relatively swift progress on that. And we would try to draw on all the material, take that to Minister, stakeholder engagement. I'm stealing all your thunder. I'm going to let you speak to that.
The reason Neil says I live this, I've looked at all of the reports since 2010. The Committee of Finance and Personnel did a report and it was 52 recommendations. You add then any recommendations from the NIAO reports, I got to 186 recommendations across the last 14 years in terms of public procurement. That leads us then to what the new Procurement Act is going to do. Now, some of those are outdated, some of those have already been achieved, like a single portal for all tenders. We have 146 contracting authorities who use eTenders NI. So we should probably congratulate ourselves for some of the key things that we have that other jurisdictions envy. Like we have centralised procurement. All our departments buy through a COPE over £30,000. Other jurisdictions, England, Wales and Scotland, don't have that. Their departments buy for themselves. So we are ahead, and that's simply because of our size. We do have 9 unique portfolios, and that is because we buy water. You know, NI Water, Translink, all of the other COPes have their own special portfolios. But what that 186 recommendations has allowed us to do is to say what gaps still exist, where do we need to learn the lessons, and certainly efficiency has come out. You know, how do you demonstrate that the structures you have are delivering value for money? Accessibility, SMEs, are they being able to access the documents, and even if they do, are those tenders structured in a way that they can actually bid for it and make sure that the risk profile hasn't been unequal. And then transparency and then social value. So all of those things that all of the reports in Northern Ireland have said that they would like to see from a procurement function has led us to the skeleton of this strategy. Our ministers had a review of the strategy, and our next stage will be good to go out and consult with our stakeholders and with the departments to see, you know, if they think this fills the gap. The other thing for us is the Procurement Act. There are some things that we've opted out of because they're policy levers, so we have the responsibility to fill those policy gaps if our executive wants us to do that. So those are the things that we will be coming to the executive to see whether we can use our policy levers to do that. So we have a good strategy, I believe. SIB has also had a look at it, and they think it's going in the right direction as well. So our next step is to socialise that with our key stakeholders and departments. The other thing we're doing in tandem with that is the Procurement Policy Note 0121, Score and Social Value. We did take a commitment to review that. The executive obviously would like to see that review, so we are talking to our industries, construction sector, FSB. I think you mentioned you've going to take some evidence from them. CBI, IOD, all the letters of the alphabet. We need to discuss exactly how this will impact on their industry, but also how it will help. We really need to help. We've given you some figures about SMEs winning government contracts. Micro businesses are in there as well, so we need to make sure that in Northern Ireland, whatever we do, doesn't impact on the businesses that actually thrive, both on public and private sector spend.
Thank you. Just one question. One last question. You touched on the Education Authority. It must have been about half an hour ago now, but you know, that's one of the things I personally, anyway, I believe is critical and needs significant attention in terms of the procurement practices. If you could just give some detail about that, and also within the NI Audit Report under Figure 2, legal challenges made against procurement decisions in Northern Ireland. The Education Authority between 2020 and 2021 was 14, which is significantly more than anybody else. Is there a reason for that?
You go ahead. No, please. You're on a roll.
My understanding on that, and I can be corrected, is that's 14 on one contract because there were 14 writs brought in, and my understanding, if I'm thinking about the same one, they actually collapsed that. In terms of the new frameworks, our Minister gets, because everybody thinks CPD, procurement in the title, is the Minister of Finance. Education Authority are a centre of procurement expertise in their own right, so they will set their practices out, and one of their practices is that when they set a framework up, every school has to use that framework. And we've had anecdotal that someone in a rural school down in Portaferry has to wait for somebody coming from Enniskillen to do a piece of minor works from a carbon point of view, from a value for money point of view. So they're rectifying that in their new framework. So schools will have the autonomy to carry out their low value minor works. Now, I can't speak to the Education Authority, but if any school wants to have more detail, certainly if they contact their estates team in the Education Authority, they'll give them an idea of the timelines and what this means from them, obviously, in terms of how they can go ahead and do that.
But we've already had very fruitful conversations with the new Chief Executive in the Education Authority, just about making sure as well what role we can play in terms of the policies, and as we think about the new strategy and structures about what are those principles. You mentioned sort of carbon dimensions, you mentioned sort of social value, so there are a lot of pieces of that puzzle that if each COPE has its own expertise, but if we have some common transparency reporting frameworks, then it'll become a little bit easier and clearer to report on that.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Sharon. Neil. We'll move to Cal.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you very much for your answers so far. And I'm not going to get into the direction of travel. You mentioned the autumn and everything else. Neil, I'm just going to concentrate on why we're here today and how the recommendations of the Audit Office report. And I want to talk about the structures in particular. I have a number of questions just go down that route. But the report sets out the largely decentralised structure within which the public procurement is delivered. I'd welcome your commentary on why the procurement system is structured as it currently is.
It's a really good question, because even in the time that I've been in post, we've come some interesting experiments around that about whether things work best centralised or decentralised. And the truth of the matter is each has its flaws. So we have an example which I'll let Sharon speak to about health projects group, where we've had it both centralised to try and drive some more efficiencies and then decentralised it again, because actually it then became the disconnect with the actual sector and other colleagues and people in that. It ended up, Sharon will say more about it, becoming a little bit less, the disbenefits were outweighing the benefits. So what that has taught me is that the structure that we have, again, comes after what you're trying to achieve, and actually the idea that it can all be centralised probably does a disservice to the complexity of procurement, because the level of specialist knowledge about very particular areas and the way that they procure, what are the appropriate limits, what are the appropriate controls, doesn't really lend itself to being done in one single place. But that doesn't mean things like reporting, monitoring can't be done in a central place, or principles or policy guidelines can't be set. But I think my recent experience has been that actually the benefits that you think you might get from the efficiencies of doing anything in one place can lead to a greater disconnect to the sector that you're trying to serve. But what was important from that lesson was we were able to bring that in, see if it worked, and then decant it back out to the health department relatively seamlessly and quickly once we'd realised this actually wasn't driving the benefits that we thought. And you certainly lived through that experience in terms of what we thought we would get out of it, bringing it in centrally and then sending it back out, because it just wasn't quite working the way we'd hoped.
Yep. So in 2013, the SIB report on commissioning major capital projects suggested that we should move to a more centralised model. Now, we didn't get executive agreement for that, but what we did was get an agreement between the Department of Health and Department of Finance ministers to move health estates, as it was at that time, into CPD. So they came into CPD in 2014. In 2018, the DOF Business Consultancy Service did a review of how that transition had worked, and they identified a number of issues. Lack of clarity and understanding about the roles and responsibilities of each of the organisations, and that was in Department of Health, CPD, and also the trusts, the arm's length bodies. Lack of understanding of the limitation of roles and responsibilities of the partner organisations. A significant reduction in the resources available to support the arm's length body, so the trusts felt that there was a dilution of service when there was a centralisation, and a lack of prioritisation of the use of the resources. So when I took over my role in July 2021, I looked at the memorandum of understanding between ourselves and health and didn't feel that it had actually closed that gap. I couldn't see what the accountability lines were. I felt that there was a blur in the accountability. It also became evident before I joined that when COVID hit, the Department of Health actually seconded the Grade 5 from health projects, which was in DOF, back into health, because they knew that they needed that expertise within their organisation. And when we tried to get the memorandum understanding to the extent where they felt that they were getting the service that they had in 2014, we realised that we would never be able to deliver that. So we set up a team to move that back in. Now, 1 year on, they've done a review, and I don't actually want to take the committee's time, but I have a full list of things that they think have improved when health have moved back. But the biggest one is that they lost that sense of subject matter expertise. When that technical group, now Health Projects is about 40 to 50 staff. They're architects, they're engineers, they're surveyors, they're they're civils. They felt they lost that level of expertise within health that diluted their ability to respond quicker to their whole estates piece. So they'd moved into procurement function and ignored the fact that when they were in the organisation, they were delivering a lot better service and advisory role in the Department of Health than they felt able to do in the Department of Finance. But in saying that, we moved, when Justice was devolved in 2008, we moved NIO team into CPD. And there was 28 staff moved across, and we were able to very quickly integrate those staff into what we buy. They just became a normal department. We now run that procurement with 9 staff. So there will always be an area of getting a better service, but it's only when that is knitted neatly with what the other areas do. So I do, and I did a thesis at one stage between centralisation and decentralisation. They do both have their merits, but when you dilute a service by bringing it in, then that is more detrimental to the overall service rather than procurement. And I think what the NIAO report does and what the new regulations does is broaden out the definition of procurement. Procurement isn't the tendering piece. That's the bit that has been regulated since mid-1990s. We've got that down to a very fine art. It's commissioning, it's finding out what you need to buy, and that comes back into the business case, market engagement. What are other jurisdictions? What are they doing in terms of this? We're very, very rarely we buy something that doesn't exist somewhere else. So it is that horizon scanning, the benchmarking, and then going into the tendering piece. But as Michael said, the biggest benefit and where you can get most value is actually managing a contract. And what we have done over the last, probably since 2020, we have over 1,000 staff who have now trained Contract Management Foundation. We understand that we have to equip people not just in the procurement function, but actually in the departments themselves. So we've been doing a huge piece of work in that, as other departments have been doing as well.
And just 2 other quick points. Does the structure inhibit effective strategic leadership in any way? And how can you evaluate the efficiency of procurement?
To the first one, I think my considered answer to that would be no, not necessarily. I think if you put the right reporting governance in place, the structure is too complicated to say that actually one size would fit all. So it's always very easy to say, look, if this was just simpler, there was one, but it's not all the same. Procurement's complex. So actually, I don't believe the structure as it's set up at the moment. I think it can function very well with centres of expertise, with very specialist knowledge, if we can then set up a more common reporting framework on what they do. But to your second question, it does definitely increase the complexity of being able to understand and monitor and performance. That's definitely the case. It's what the report points out. And as we've said, it's definitely an area that we think needs considerable improvement. But I don't think the answer to that, my professional opinion, is that it would not be. The answer would not be if it was all in one big group. Everything would work easier, would be easier to control. And we've got a few case studies that we've talked about that have said actually that distills the level of specialist knowledge that you need. So I think the answer is no, the structure wouldn't define whether we can manage it and get good performance, but actually reporting is probably key to us to be able to see whether the structure is working as effectively. Last very quick point, the one I already made though, is you also have to be willing to move if it's not working in a way that it should. And so we shouldn't see structure as a great inhibitor. We should just change it if we need to change it and not be too wedded to one model. If it needs to be centralised, centralise it. If it needs to be decentralised, do that, but do it quickly and effectively. So I wouldn't have any, if you like, hard, fast rules as to there's some sort of perfect structure. I think that the decanted model isn't too bad at all if we have the correct reporting.
Just sorry, and did you say there was a review of the structure or an element of the... Sorry, I'm just clarifying.
It was reviewed back in 2018. The business consultancy service did a review when health moved into CPD. And that is important. And I do think, you know, when we put something in place, and that's what's happening with the PPN 0121. We're doing a review. We committed to do a review, and I think it's important. And I think if we were to criticise ourselves, it took us a long time to review the PGNs that were on our website. There was over 40 when we looked at this in 2020. And a lot of them were just restating legislation or gold plating things that we didn't need. And there was a lot of prescription, because sometimes when something goes wrong, the automatic response was to plug it with a piece of guidance, and that became a very prescriptive. And then everybody focused on the process. The process was king. And then you only have to have one legal challenge, and then that makes you focus on the process for maybe the next 10 or 15 contracts. And I do think, like, we obviously, when our minister came in, we looked at the number of contracts that we had that were reserved. And reserved means that you can focus on social enterprises or organisation whose obviously main aim isn't profit. And we set on a pathway of reserving a number of contracts. We tried to reserve 3 contracts, and we were legally challenged on each one. The writ went in, we had court cases, we had affidavits. It didn't stop us going for another reserved contract, and that was because we had the leadership and support. And I think that sometimes we just need to be brave and work through those legal impediments. Like there is some rhetoric out there to say when this new act comes in, there's a huge amount of flexibility. The worst thing that we can do is not actually harness that flexibility, but with flexibility comes a potential risk of a challenge, because somebody's judgment will be challenged. And that's where we as leaders need to make sure that our staff are supported and that they are trained and skilled to do that, and that's where networks will become hugely important.
It's also worth saying, and Sharon will roll her eyes at this, but you're going to hear almost every time that I'm back in one of these sessions, there is a structure to good governance in my mind of what I think I need to provide from an accounting officer. One of them is that we know the strategic direction we've been given politically as to what you're trying to achieve. But to go back to points that we made earlier about reactive versus proactive, that regular schedule of updating policies and not leaving things lie or having strategic documents that have the wrong titles. And that comes back to a schedule and a set of ownership where you're saying this policy was last reviewed in X, it's next due for review in Y, rather than waiting to the incident that pops up to need to review it. And that's something my team are very exhausted with me saying. Who's the document owner? When's it next updated? What's the next schedule? And that brings a little bit of structure rather than necessarily saying there's a whole different model that works, but how do we make sure that everything we've put in place has a regular review cycle?
Thank you. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Cathal. I'll let Coleman, but just briefly picking up on a slight point, I may have picked it up slightly wrong. Did you say there, Neil, in your answer to Cathal, that the existing system can work if specialist knowledge was in place?
Yes, if we think about a centralised model of procurement, what we learned from that health project's experience was there are very specialist types of procurement, types of skill sets, but that also benefits from being very close to other members in that, or other workers, other teams in that sector. So that close location helped keep that level of skill up. But equally, it also reminds us that each COPE knows what type of skill sets it needs in its procurement team better than we might do centrally. There may be very specific nuances to procurement law or to matters of procurement that may be very different in a health procurement arena than it would be in, for example, water or transport, and therefore relying on the COPEs to determine what type of skill set and workforce they need becomes very important. We can provide guidance and support for common skills that are needed, but there's definitely examples there that you would not have every COPE staffed with exactly the same people doing exactly the same things. There's a specialist knowledge there that is not easily provided centrally.
And you're saying doesn't exist?
Yeah, no, sorry, you did pick me up on it, and that doesn't necessarily exist in abundance that we could provide centrally. So yes, apologies, no, I was not making any remark that the health teams was missing that talent.
Okay.
Just to pick up on a small point coming out of Cal's question, Sharon, you said there was 3 reserved, the first 3 reserved contracts you put out, there was 3 court cases. Yeah. Are those resolved or outstanding, and how did they go?
They withdrew, but it was like 6 months down. We had all the affidavits done, we had court dates scheduled, and they withdrew their affidavit. And the thing that we were really able to rely on was, because they said, who made the decision to reserve? And it was very easy for us to point back to the social value policy. But it was time consuming, and it's not for the faint hearted. If you get the first challenge, you probably say, well, just open it to everybody. But I've concentrated on PPN 0121, which is scoring social value, but there's a PPN 0221, which is about commission of social services. This comes back to the risk aversion point. Some people will procure everything the same way because it's the process they're concentrating on, and this is the shift in culture. It's trying to get people to be very clear on what they're trying to procure or commission. And we would very much say grant funding there should not be procurement in some areas at the minute, and there should be some grant funding in areas particularly that to the person, whether it's health, social or community services.
Yeah.
But we're working closely with the departments on that.
I ask that, and it's good that a precedent of some sort has been established, because any transformation will challenge the status quo, and therefore will be, and it's vital that you can point to policy to make changes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom Buchanan, MLA.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question on risk aversion, and I know that this was touched on a little earlier on in the questioning, and you did say that leadership was important in tackling risk aversion, but when you go through the Audit Office report, it highlights a culture of undue risk aversion as being a systematic issue within procurement. What then, in your opinion, are the reasons for this?
It can be complicated in that Sharon's already alluded to. It is a great challenge. You know, when you get your first legal writ, and when you're thinking, well, a lot's going to happen as to what's going to be the next one-to-one with my line manager about the fact that this procurement's been challenged, and so much of that comes down to the tone that's set by me, it's set by colleagues at the leadership table, by Sharon, and saying no, we will continue, we'll press ahead, we'll support you on that. The decisions that my procurement team take, it's my responsibility to own those, but it's important that we lead and encourage people to come back even if it's been challenging. Lessons learned, go again. Now, as the previous question pointed out, there is a number of legal challenges, and there is evidence that and data that shows it's less costly to carry out legal challenge in this jurisdiction. The numbers are not incredibly high, but that doesn't tell the full story, because there's the fear of litigation that exists, which then means, as Sharon said, the easiest thing is procure what you've always done in the way that you always did it, that wasn't challenged, and it won't be challenged again. And the only true answer to that is leadership, training, culture, strategy, and policy direction. So I think we are improving considerably on that, but as procurements get more complicated, get more complex, then the idea of just trying to find a system that worked somewhere else is a natural tendency. So the short answer to the question for me is it absolutely stems from the leadership in the organisation. Will you support your team to try and do something new? And what new things should they be doing? The things that are set out in the strategic direction. And that social value one is a prime example of yes, we'll go again. And once you've done that 2, 3, 4 times, won the challenge, then it becomes more common practice that that's the normal way of doing it. But what you cannot do is react poorly to that challenge, come in, learn lessons, and go again if it's the right thing to do. So I think it's predominantly a leadership challenge.
So it appears it's a learning process right through.
It is. You must support your staff in what they do. We provide training and support. There's been new guidelines on innovative policy making, and it's a culture change that's happening right across the services to make our staff feel fully supported in making those brave decisions, making sure they do it evidenced, and if we do make a mistake, learn from that, make sure we don't make it again, but don't then necessarily determine that that wasn't the right course of action. So I take significant responsibility for making sure that that is the culture within the Department of Finance.
Thank you. The Audit Office describes the concerns expressed by COPE about their ability to recruit and retain the full range of suitable qualified staff that they need to perform effectively. What action has been taken at a strategic level by the Procurement Board to investigate the scale and impact of this issue and support work towards any practical remedies?
Colleagues will have more to say on this, but it is probably and it's not just linked to procurement, but it's probably the greatest concern that I have at the moment is the ability for public service to attract, define out the very particular skill sets that it needs. So that therefore means that a big responsibility on us is to train our own and provide the support and development and training to allow staff to come in. So what things that we are taking through on our HR side is looking increasingly towards apprenticeships, looking towards new graduate schemes, looking at new ways of training our own. But critically, if that's going to work, it has to be a profession and a sector and an employer that people want to come to. And we have challenges in terms of salary competitiveness, of course, and again, that's something to look at. But what type of employer are we? A supportive and inclusive one that will back our staff, one that will give them the opportunity to work on some of the most transformational projects in the place that they live in. I think that selling of the jobs is an important job that we have to do at an HR side, which I also have responsibility for. But we also have to work on supporting our staff, training them. I am very concerned about the level of support that we have, even centrally in staffing, given the budget cuts that we've faced and continue to face. You're looking at 50% of Michael's team with him being here today. So it is one of the it's as true as it was when it was written, and it's becoming an increasing concern about being able to support and develop our staff. I know you'll want to say a little bit about that, Sharon and Michael, because actually we can do none of this if we don't have the people. It's the most important piece, and each of the COPs is saying, I have very particular challenges in attracting certain pockets of talent that I need. So we've done so much in terms of training and development, but again, people who've delivered a major project, people who've been involved in procurement, becomes a very attractive skill set to have elsewhere in the service. So we're also training people who are then moving on, rightly, and that means we need to have the right pipeline.
We are a victim of our own success because our skills are so transferable, and we are losing people to the private sector. And there was one move last week for an increase of £10,000 in their salary, which is something that you can't compete with. This session I was with the construction group this morning, it was about skills. There is a skills deficit across Northern Ireland, and when people think of procurement, they think of procurement advisors, people that have the Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply, but we have architects, building surveyors, engineers and quantity surveyors. We got 2 new quantity surveyors in, and I'm literally making them tea and saying, are they okay? They're having a good day, because I want to keep them. And it's really, really difficult to keep staff, but it's not only this jurisdiction. We've done a video for procurement professionals across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, Northern Ireland. And we're having a procurement conference at the end of May, funded by the Cabinet Office, and that is to try and raise the profile of our of what we do, because people don't understand what procurement means. People don't understand what a job in the civil service means. Like, you could have anything from somebody who's managing or operating a drone to somebody who's buying a drone and managing the contract, and anything in between. Like, we buy helicopters, we buy fleet for police, we buy uniforms, we buy really anything that a prison service needs to operate. All of those things are really exciting when young people, and we were talking this morning about careers advisors and how we attract people in, and really it's about getting into school children even before they go to secondary school and start to choose their subjects. We had a good discussion about higher level apprentices and how we get, and we actually heard from a girl who's in the civil engineering higher level apprentices. It's really difficult. Short answer is we're growing our own, because we find it hugely difficult to attract and retain staff and keep them in the civil service. You talked on risk, and one of the things, we have to make it attractive, and some of the areas of risk are that people are fearful of, either it's internal audit or external audit, and this is your innovation guide. You know, we need to change the conversation from people who don't want to do anything because if you do something you might fail, to people who are empowered and want to be innovative and want to be creative. And that's really what journey we're on, because we have to do that to keep people. If people think the job is boring or very risky, or you're going to be, in front of the PermSec or Audit Office, then it's going to be really difficult for us to get people in. Now, we understand that some of the people that we're looking to bring in, we don't need all the time, so it's specialist services, and we look to SIB or we look to consultants, and then obviously it's a value for money consideration. We much prefer to grow our own and to keep that talent in-house. I think the challenge that we all face with constrained budgets is to make sure that pipeline's continuously growing. But it is a challenge not just for the private sector, it is a challenge for us going forward.
Well, given the difficulties you are facing, are you aware of any pooling or sharing of resources between COPE to help alleviate staffing or skill shortages?
Sorry, do you want to go ahead? No, go ahead. Collaborative procurement is as close as we have got to that. So rather than every organisation buying their public sector telephony network, we have a shared service for that. We have a shared service for other contracts to save procurement organisations having to buy continuously, and the same thing. Where we need to get to and where the technology is, my view of this is we've not enough staff to take out of the day job to see how we go with this, is artificial intelligence and digitalisation. Like, I don't even want to quantify the amount of money across the system trying to generate the reports for our annual report. The COPE assessment, there used to be an external COPE assessment that was done every 3 or 4 years. There was hundreds of thousands of pounds of time and effort into those COPE assessments, and we had to ask ourselves, what's the value if everybody's passing every time? And yet, during that period, we had the same amount of complaints, the same amount of legal challenges. So we have to build value into the system. We have to take nugatory effort out. So all of those administrative tasks that don't need a procurement professional or an architect or a quantity surveyor, but I do, like in schools, what we're looking for is standardisation. You know, you shouldn't be designing schools, you know, one school design is not another. So there is a piece of work certainly, and a lot of it's driven from financial constraints. There's simply not the money in the system. But efficiency is the right way to go, even if you weren't constrained.
Yes, and we have, not to delay us too much, it's probably for another session on a different report in time, we have some actions underway around the people in OD, which is part of our sort of HR system. We're taking a review of the professions that we have across the system, which procurement's one. And then in other areas, we've set up networks of our SROs. We've got a new IT, a new technology system coming for our HR systems in time, which will hopefully help us be better at being able to say we have talented people right across the system, where and when do we need them. The challenge with that can often be, if you've delivered a very significant project, that can be incredibly taxing mentally and emotionally, and it may not be that might be best for the system for us to say we now need you on this next most difficult project, but that may not be best for that individual's well-being, but we need better data for that. So there is a project underway about reviewing professions. There's a project underway looking at installing our new ERP system, where hopefully we'll get much better at saying, here are our talented people across the service. When might I need them? Because you're quite right, we are not going to be able to provide every skill set in every COPE. We're going to need to be able to lean in with the particular expertise when it's required. So that's a big important sort of workforce model consideration about which of those, if you like, emergency teams that come into specific issues, and what are the, if you like, BAU staff that's needed. So there's lots of HR initiatives and OD initiatives underway, but as Sharon said, it is a deep concern to me about our ability to retain and attract the talent that we need in procurement as well as other areas.
Thank you. Tom has another question, then we're moving on, but just members, if we could be conscious of time, and Neil, Sharon and Michael Weiss, I appreciate the detailed answers you're given. If we could get straight to the point on some of the things and elaborate where we can.
Not a thing I'm renowned for, but I will do my very best. You can be here to summer if you listen.
I say that in a friendly way. It's just we've drank more water than most of the building, I think. In the course of the meeting. All right, Tom.
Okay. My last question is, there is a concern that the Procurement Board has not been actively evaluating capacity and capability amongst contracting authorities. Do you agree it is essential that the Board should be delivering this oversight?
Quick answer, I think again that depends exactly what accountability and responsibility framework we set up that goes alongside the new strategic direction. It certainly will only be possible if it has the requisite data to be able to make that assessment, and it goes back to what sort of data do we want to collect and in what way. It's an easy thing to say to report on skills shortages, but it's actually more difficult when you think about it to be specific about exactly what skills you need and what quantum of it. So the Board didn't have a particular focus on that, as we talked about earlier, but it's certainly something under the new framework we'll be looking at.
And has the issue been remedied in any way since the report's publication?
Well, there is a responsibility upon each accounting officer that has a responsibility for a COPE, and what I have too. It's in their interest to make sure that's succeeding. So each one of them, and I can speak about the competitions we've tried to run, the difficulties we've had in our own COPEs. So each could speak to their own, but predominantly it's not been a centralised solution to that. It's been at the accounting officers' own engagement with their COPE to look at what sort of skills and talent and recruitment they need. We've certainly looked at it in my own department, but we continue to sit with a significant number of vacancies, unfortunately.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, Patrick Delargy, MLA. Patrick's online.
Thank you, Chair. Just checking you can hear me okay before we start.
Yeah, we hear you perfectly. We see you as well.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for your answers so far. And to be honest, you already partially answered a lot of the questions that I had. But I suppose really what I wanted to know and to get a wee bit more detail on was just around your view really on the key capacity issues that affect the contract authorities in the north. And I suppose within that capability as well, you've already touched on a lot of those points and gone into detail on some of them, but it's more the headlines of what you see as the big issues within that.
I actually think it's a combination of skill sets that are needed. You need that strategic thinking in any COPE in terms of thinking ahead about what needs done, what the ultimate goal is, and the leadership challenges, which are always in short supply in any business. But then there are very particular, and that's why we've been doing the training that we have to try and make sure we have people with the delivery skills and the contract management skills, which can be very different to the procurement issues. But I think the most important answer I would give is that you have to have and stay very close to the changing environment in which you operate, because the skills that you need change all the time. It's not a fixed set of skills. We need more ability to adapt to digital technology, for example. So the procurement skills that we need are evolving all the time. More things are being done in a different way, but each and every COPE will have its own specialist concern. Sharon's already mentioned some areas. The building requirements are relatively straightforward, so therefore perhaps the architecture or civil engineering skills are more modest, but that's not the case in some other areas where that's the most complex. So it actually differs across each of the COPEs, I think would be fair to say. But the honest assessment is each and every one of them is having challenges around recruitment.
Okay, thank you for that. And I suppose that brings me on to the next question really, which is just around, could you provide any update for me on the progress made since the report on procuring a replacement for the e-tender system? And obviously within that as well, kind of a wee bit more information if you could on maybe the reasons why you don't think that went to plan, and on how we can ensure that that doesn't happen again in the future.
Yeah, I'll let Sharon speak about the progress on the on our extension to e-tenders, but actually important piece there is there are data fields there, haven't all been completed for lots of reasons. It goes back to the point we referred to earlier, which is with the right transparency guidelines and policy requirements, we can then move to a space where it's more required to complete the data that we need once we're absolutely certain what we require. But in terms of the actual contract, which we had been looking to replace, I'll let Sharon speak to that, as we've now extended that on for another, I think it's 4 years. If I'm right.
Yeah, and Michael's the expert on e-tenders, NI, Patrick, but I suppose where we are in terms of the Procurement Act, one of the biggest changes will be a single portal for suppliers to put their information in. And we were working very closely with our current supplier in terms of I think it's an API, it's an interface between that system and our e-tenders NI system. And it was very difficult for us to go out and procure something absolutely completely new, not knowing what way the Procurement Act would go. So what we have done is contract again with the same company and the same technology through a Cabinet Office contract, which was very fortuitous for us, because to go out and procure something new when you really didn't know what the platform was going to look like. It does give us an opportunity to take stock of the exact reporting requirements that we need for any future system, but it does give us a 4-year breathing space. It's actually a very modest cost, and again, with budgets constrained, we want to make sure that we maximise the benefit and minimise the cost of anything that we're trying to do in this interim space. But in terms of like some of the organisations that are central procurement expertise in their right to have a purchase to pay system. So what we don't want to do is replicate something centrally that they already have and invested in. I think as Neil said earlier, what we're trying to do is find out what information is critical for the executive to understand how everybody's performing, and then get that from the current systems. But in terms of e-tenders NI, we have it for another 4 years. Hopefully by that stage we will have a stable transition period with the new regulations, which will give us some opportunity to see what we need going forward.
Okay.
That's great. And just, Chair, if I can just touch on maybe 2 of these short points as well, just around vacancies as well. Appreciate you have already gone into a wee bit of detail on this. Do you have any data on actually how many vacancies there are within the procurement department?
Yes, as you probably gather by now on a point of such detail, I'll be looking to Sharon, but yes, we do, and it's a as I mentioned, great concern, and it's starting to creep into almost all levels where we're having vacancy issues now. So we do have some information on that. I'll hand to Sharon in a second, but it's no longer the case of simply saying, well, if we could just get adverts out. It's becoming harder and harder to get people to even apply for the job. So the vacancy reflects not only a somebody's retired, somebody's left. It actually also is a signal that we're going to have to do quite a bit of work to make this a job and a sector that people are going to want to come and work in the public service in.
Yeah, specifically in terms of our own centres of procurement expertise, we have 125 staff in the construction division and we have 35 vacancies. We have 43 staff in supplies and services division and we have 8 vacancies. Now, I did do a trawl across all centres of procurement expertise, don't have their data on top of my head, but all of them are carrying vacancies, and the largest vacancies are in Department for Infrastructure. And when you look at where our money's, where the biggest spend area is, it's Department for Infrastructure. So they were probably suffering more than other centres of procurement expertise.
Yeah. And I mean, look, you've answered my second question anyway, and I can certainly, from a constituency perspective, I suppose I've seen that firsthand, those gaps as well, and that's what we're hearing. So be keen to get, if it's okay with you, to get that other data, just around those sectors that you don't have. Appreciate it, that you wouldn't have all those to hand, but I think it'd be really useful just for us to have as a comparative figure. So if those could be sent on, I think that'd be really useful. Chair, if that's okay, thank you.
Thank you, Padraig, and thank you, Sharon and Neil, for answering those questions. Diane Forsyth, MLA.
Yep. Thank you very much. And just to jump back to Tom Buchanan and some of Padraig's questions on capacity and capability, I just wanted to ask quickly, how confident are you that the capacity and capability issues that have been mentioned can be resolved within the current procurement structures in the short to medium term future?
The honest answer to that is it would be something that causes me great concern. So I think without a level of, and this is happening across jurisdictions, about looking at the attractiveness of posts, looking at our ability to find other ways to deliver, I do not see us, I know from the data, it's not just advertising, we're just not getting people. That means we've got to look at remuneration conditions, we've got to look at the role and specifications, and we've got to find a way of making it attractive and train our own. Training our own is not a short answer to that. So it actually is of huge concern to me, and it comes back to some of the previous points on that. Then makes it incumbent upon us to think about sharing resource and things where we can and being more fluid and flexible about that. I would not be confident that this will be an easily solved problem. In fact, I would say that across a lot of other parts of public service at the minute, it would be my number one concern, is making it a sector that our young people are coming running towards rather than not even hearing about. And we've got a lot of work to do to try and improve that.
I think having that on record is important, because vacancies across the civil service and critical roles really, it's been a lot of pressure on it. I know that from a number of different committees that I've listened to. To move on, data and transparency has been a key theme coming through in the Audit Office report, and the report itself details the absence of a regular flow of timely, high quality data from the COPs and contracting authorities to the Procurement Board over many years. I want to ask, why was this tolerated and allowed to persist, given the huge amount of spend in this area?
It is a very fair and reasonable question to ask. Certainly, we look at the complexity of providing the data. We think when we talk about it, or I certainly would have thought it was more straightforward than you would imagine. As Michael's spoken about, we've been okay at being able to measure how contracts that we've issued, the money going out. We've struggled much more because of issues of, well, we've our own system, we pay it in a different way, there's no consistency around that. So whilst the measurement of that in the past has clearly not been where it should be, I believe that that's something, it's absolutely throughout the new Procurement Act about transparency and publication of that. So whilst I can't promise, what I can do is that commitment. I don't know what will be in our new strategic guidelines, but it's highly unlikely not to have transparency within it, given the importance it has everywhere else. And this will make it a different requirement and governance. Now with the new procurement notices too, we're a little bit more succinct in terms of what we ask for, and that will allow us again to make it a requirement of what type of information we get. Michael, is that fair?
Yeah, I think the answer to your question, one of the difficulties we've had is that because the centres of expertise do different things, they actually record different data in different ways to suit their own purposes, and they name it. So we've always had a difficulty in getting a consistent data set. I think what the report is hinting at is that, as Neil said, what should that data set be to analyse it, to set strategic direction for procurement. and we'd need to sit down with a new procurement board or a new forum and agree that. And I think once we get the data set, then we can encourage people to start recording in a format that can be bagged. But as Neil's also said, that one of the thrusts in the new Act is transparency, and organisations will be required to publish a huge range of data that they've never published before. And I'm hoping that that data then becomes readily available, that it doesn't become a chore to go and ask for a manual exercise to be done to collect it.
Well, thank you. And I know, Michael, from sitting on the Finance Committee, you briefed us in detail about the new Procurement Act, and I understand how it's going to simplify a lot of these things, and there's a lot of hope going forward. But just coming back to this question again, the fact that this has persisted for so long with such poor information coming back, to follow up, were there no questions added to this in terms of common sense checks? Because this is a very real frustration on the ground, where all of us as constituency MLAs hear frustrations from the end user as to, I've had to use the COPE, I've had to use the award, I've had to pay £10 for a sellotape block that I can buy in my local supermarket for £2.50. So it's just, whenever it's going forward, I know there'll be the legislation, and I just worry this is very overcomplicated, and at the end of the day, procurement comes down to buying goods at the best price and in a way that the end user can understand. So it's just, I want to ask, will you be building those common sense checks into policies and things going forward?
Very much so. Getting that balance right is critical. The new Act both tries to speak to greater flexibilities, less bureaucracy, but at the same time more transparency in reporting. So looking at appropriate levels of reporting and whether they be over certain limits or what's required. It seems a simple thing to ask for, but different organisations classify different stages in the procurement in a different way. So absolutely, it's one of the most critical things here is a painless way to provide the level of proportionate reporting. I think it's important, though, is also to remind, I think of my own role as an accounting officer. I would have very close relationships to my own COPEs, so there would have been that level of scrutiny within education, within health, within infrastructure for their own COPE, that there is another reporting mechanism there. Clearly the procurement board had its focus on driving social value, decluttering the policy landscape. It had a finite bandwidth. Those were obviously the most pressing issues at the time. It would come rightly to the accounting officer, those level of complaints from constituents through yourselves, and each of them would have responded those in their own way. We certainly have done in our own area where we've had critiques about very particular things. I don't know how many times I've come down to Sharon about a very specific question and said, look up that contract for me, get me the answer to that as quickly as we can. So each would have responded, but I absolutely take the thrust of the question. The easiest thing to do, and as a sort of lapsed economist, this is always my natural tendency, is to record everything, but that will become onerous and counterproductive. So getting that balance right is going to be absolutely critical in the new systems and processes.
I think that, to come back to the point about the role of sellotape, you're absolutely right that one of the thrusts of transforming public procurement here is to shift it from a process-focused role to a more commercially driven. And that's to make sure we get the roll of sellotape at the right price, to make sure we manage risk in the right way, to make sure we apportion it within the contract and we're not afraid. So the flexibility is coming in October to be able to drive that home. And as Sharon said previously, these toolkits that we published 2 years ago, they are full of the best commercial practice in there, how to proportion risk, how to assess risk, how to do payment mechanisms, how to get the best deal out of the market. And we're hoping people will now have the flexibility with the change in the law to actually fully embrace those toolkits and really change that culture.
Well, thank you. And you've noted in the current format there's not really a coordinated approach being across the public bodies, but going forward that would be the hope to build it in. So I'm not asking anything more about that. But given that you've estimated around 25% of total resources available to the Northern Ireland Executive are used for procurement, it's absolutely essential that we have quality data available to monitor performance. And can you explain how the performance is monitored effectively in the absence of this information? And are KPIs set and monitored, or how is this reported?
Yes, each COPE will have its own reporting in each contract. For example, we have our own KPIs and monitoring in that. As I spoke about, we also have the sort of business case, and for those bigger procurements, we have a mechanism there for authorising the expenditure on the back of the information in a business case. But we certainly, within our own COPEs, we have a set of KPIs against which we monitor, and each one of them will have their own methods of reporting.
Yeah. And I mentioned the COPE accreditation process that happened until 2018. That was replaced by self-assessment, but the biggest monitoring arrangements that we could see was the transparency of the reporting. So in 2020 it was that every PPN, which didn't happen previously, has a more monitoring requirement. So it was felt that if you get it out to the public, how many contracts are being reserved, how many contracts have done the community sort of been grant funded around the procurement, that there would almost be a sort of, as Michael said, the civic society would tell you that they're doing something wrong. And I think the frustration, and that was mentioned in the report, the frustration is that sometimes people say that's procurement stops us doing that, but there's nothing stopping, in our view, the Education Authority delegating the limit down to schools in terms of buying their stationery. And that is a decision for Education Authority, and I'm sure with the executive back the focus will be on that, because that is the complaints that we hear. But it's not procurement that stops that happen, it is policies and practices within certain organisations. It comes back to the risk aversion. If we aggregate it all and everybody has to buy the same thing, but it's not how much are we paying for that. The other thing is to move away from lowest price, because lowest price is not how money is spent in the public sector, it's best value for money. So you have sustainability, miles travelled, all the environmental elements, all the making sure modern slavery, all of those things that wrap around a contract to make sure you aren't buying the cheapest, but the impact of that is people aren't getting a fair wage, people aren't being able to work in a good environment. So all of that comes into consideration, which is probably the biggest difference between public spend and private spend. There's that extra social, environmental and economic consideration.
Thank you. And you had noted before, in terms of you were speaking about the staff vacancies within your own department, I think I'd noted you've over 160 staff working on procurement. So across all the departments, there's quite a lot of staff working on procurement tasks. So there's quite a significant cost to the civil service of procurement. So in respect of COPE performance, the Audit Office report notes that the work was ongoing to develop a new balanced scorecard model to be able to report out the money spent by the civil service on delivering centre procurement excellence services to be captured and reported, and to be able to show the value added. So I was wondering how this has progressed since the Audit Office report.
Well, even before the Audit Office report, and I can only speak about how my COPE makes sure that we are efficient as possible, we do time activity recording. So every hour that you spend on a project, whether it's pre-tender, tender, evaluation, contract management, and that's all mapped out. And our clients, so for the likes of DOJ, we will invoice them for the services that we procure. We're on a cost recovery basis, there's no profit, so really the cost of procurement for all of the departments would be the operating costs for CPD. Now what you'll have, and we talked about the helpful definition in the NI AO report, is procurement is somebody identifies, I need to buy something, I can't do something in-house. So it's the person that specifies the services, carries out the pre-market engagement, the economists that are involved in that. So that is the end-to-end cost of buying something, and you're right, we do need to be as efficient as possible. So any layers of bureaucracy, or just to be sure, or getting somebody to check the work of somebody else, throughout the system there is a cost. But in terms of the pure cost for procurement, we are as transparent, and sometimes I get very frustrated when there's a room of 17 people in and there's 2 procurement people. We know the cost of our time because we will have to go back and input what we've done on that time and how much it's cost. And there's not the same culture across all departments. So we can certainly be very, very visible in our time. And we have a management, managing public money has a framework in terms of charging, so it's very much clearly audited as well. And as Neil said, the Audit Office came in to look at Supplies and Services Division, how we charge customer satisfaction, and that there wasn't any issues. Like I used to meet when I was head of the Supplies and Services Division with my key account managers every 6 months to show them what we've done for them and how the costs have decreased. So you're right, there has to be KPIs, there have to be an eye on what we're costing, not only what we're buying. And I think we are very transparent in that.
Thank you. And I think, again, going back to a point that has been made before, you can only report on what you're doing in your own COPEs, but I think that where you're doing things like that, very transparent time reporting, efficiency reporting, it should be a model by which others are advised upon rolling out. I just have one further question, Chair, if you don't mind. The Federation of Small Businesses submitted some written evidence material to us, and it was around concerns over prompt payments of public sector contracts. And I know their figures were from the report in 2022 where they were noting more than 234,000 invoices that weren't paid within the legal requirement of 30 days. And like I would be very concerned about this. I have a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in my own constituency coming to me all the time that they cannot get on board with the public sector contracts for a number of different reasons, and this is one of them, because if you're a small or medium business and you are going to have to be out tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds out of your own money before it's paid back by the department, you're straight away off the table. That you're not getting a business loan to back you up for that. But quite often those small and medium-sized local businesses will provide, in my opinion, a lot of the time, better priced services in a locality, especially a rural area like mine in South Down. And another point that came through in the report was that they had raised, how the implication would be that the smaller, better value for money providers are getting priced out of the market, but the data in this area was insufficient to create a private sector prompt payment scorecard for Northern Ireland. So I just wanted to ask, why is there such insufficient data on that we can't take this forward as an action point to widen this field?
Well, colleagues will come in, but it's interesting because, well, I don't recognise the number, I must say, and I get data on prompt payments from our point of view. I don't know whether that includes local government or exactly how that's referred to, but I get data from NI Direct and the information, and we have an incredibly stringent targets on 10-day payments and 30-day payments. What I will take away, if you're agreeable, Chair, I'll provide you some of the latest information we have on prompt payments. I wouldn't want to say that number's incorrect at all, but it's not a number I recognise, and I certainly haven't. That point we made earlier, you judge it on the sort of queries and questions. Well, I've been in a few years now, and I've had very few recently about different things, definitely, but not about prompt payment, so it isn't a concern.
I would just say that's a 2022 report, and it does report that all 9 departments were missing out, all 11 councils and all of the trusts, and I'll happily share the report.
Absolutely, and I'll provide
and the details on it, but it was just that point around, just because you're not getting the complaints about it, it doesn't mean that it's an issue that isn't necessarily
and I do get
existing.
Reporting on it, and I don't
we give up trying.
Yeah, this is the point that I'm making.
I do actually remember the report I went to an event with FSB on it, but I think if you look at the stats, I think the department's performance, because each department publishes its performance on it, it is up around 95-98% in most departments. It's just 1 or 2. The issue may have been actually how that money goes into the supply chain, down further below the department paying. I think the numbers from the department were quite high. I know FSB would like to have seen it had 100% of payment within 30 days, but I think... Which
would be the industry standard, like it's 30 days, and we'll have a shared service payment system in the civil service that should be kicking that out within 10 days, so I don't think it's unreasonable.
I think the majority of payments, the report does reflect the majority of payments were made within 10 days, in some cases there were 5 days as well. But happy to look at it again.
And we'll provide the latest information on that.
Thank you, Chair.
Good question, Dan, and thank you for taking those questions and for agreeing to offer that information to the committee. Is Padraig Delargy still with us?
He covered his details.
Did he cover it? That's okay. Okay, we'll move on. That's good. Colin Gilrenew, MLA.
Yep, thank you, and thank you for the responses so far. So the Audit Office report does note that there's an intention set out, new decade, new approach for a review, and we have touched upon the changes made since 2020, and I know that Conor Murphy initiated a number of those changes, including the social value and the supply chain policy. So what impact have those changes had to date?
Significant, I would say, in terms of, we'll be getting again our COPES report in a few weeks, which will give us the latest figures, but significant impact on the social value side. Let colleagues speak to the specifics of that, but the report does speak to that need for the review, and as hopefully I've outlined it clearly, we've just taken a little pause to reflect on exactly what that review should cover, because of the concern that we would maybe review and focus on the structure of the procurement board without knowing what the strategy was. So we're just taking a little bit of the pause, but that will certainly be coming through in the autumn. But you're obviously closer to it, Sharon, in terms of the significant impact those changes have had.
Yeah, there's 4 themes in the Social Value Act: our social value score and social value policy, and it's environmental, employment, resilient supply chains, and the other one's just not coming to mind. And of those, there is tremendous work. Like, I think with over 3,000 placements But the biggest impact is with the social enterpriser saying that they're now able to get into the supply chain, which before they were knocking doors. Now people are coming and begging them to come and work with them. So that's the biggest impact. One of the disbenefits that we've seen is micro businesses saying this has potentially made it more difficult for them to get the foothold in. So that's why it's really important for us to review the policy and to make sure that there aren't any disincentives there. I have a full list, and I'm happy to provide this to the committee, of the benefits that the social value has brought forward. But we do believe there is more in terms of reserving contracts. And one of the themes that's probably not as well used is the net zero, the environmental one. And I do think as climate becomes more of a critical issue in terms of the goods, services and works that we procure, that will be one that we will probably want to focus on going forward. I think I've heard reports today about almost full employment. Our unemployment figures are really, really low. So I think and some of the supply chain will say that to bring apprentices on, when they don't have the surety of a pipeline, this comes back to multi-year budgets, if they don't have the surety of a pipeline, it's very difficult for them to bring apprentices on without that guaranteed work going forward. So there's definitely work to do, but and I think it's been reported, I read a journal to say that Northern Ireland, the way they've done their social value is actually more impactful than has been in other jurisdictions. So we believe it's a really good start. It's not the end of the journey, but certainly it has been a amazing start.
So given the start was to put it into the scoring matrix at 10% with a view to making it 20%, what plans are in place to get that further benefit from moving to 20%?
Well, the policy, right reason to review the policy, because we're taking evidence and consulting as it's a mixed picture as to whether it's the scoring and it's the percentage that makes the difference, or whether we're actually utilising the current framework as well as we might. We've also seen some suggestions that actually having to have that as a requirement is acting as a disincentive. So we want to be absolutely certain. In the absence of ministers, I certainly made it just to keep it at that 10 for that period of time. It would require a ministerial decision to change. So we are reviewing it, seeing it whether it's actually the percentage that's driving the behaviour, or as Sharon has said, we've had probably a stronger uptake around the areas of employability than we have, say, around. So it may be that the issues lie as much in education and supporting businesses to avail of the current metric than it might be in going up to the 20. So there's a kind of mixed picture at the minute, and we are reviewing to provide the information for the Minister, who will be looking at that procurement notice in a review.
Okay, thanks for that. The second part of that question then is around, and you have outlined that there are significant plans for future changes and not that far down the pipe. How will those plans ensure that they align with economic strategy? And in particular, I'm thinking here about regional balance. And I'm not speaking only in terms of, although it's an important issue, in terms of fairness for those companies out in regions like my own, west of the Ban, where we have world-beating small and medium enterprises. So I'm talking about how do we leverage in their expertise into the procurement process to benefit society here in general and the economy in general, as well as the fairness issue. So how will procurement align with that?
Yes, it'll be an important conversation about what those strategic themes are. It's always important to think about, as those businesses, making sure we have local suppliers, 20% going to micro businesses at the minute is important. But as each of those businesses grow, very often they want to export and expand, so they're looking to compete into another area. So it can't be as simple and as straightforward as sort of procuring by locality. But where locality can come into its own is on particularly things around the environmental and the green aspects, where cost of travel, cost of distance comes in. So I think there's an important evolution of the strategic direction as to what it means to allow procurement to make the maximum advantage that it can. I think the important dilemma we often see is that we look to our businesses to be as successful as they can, to export, to compete for other people's tenders. We laud the success of them winning contracts in other procurement areas. So therefore, you can't preclude that the other direction.
Well, that was my point. Like we have a preponderance in our area of small engineering business. I come from that sector myself. They sell all over the world. They don't think about public procurement here because they just see themselves as having been locked out of it, so they don't engage. So we're missing out on the value.
An incredibly important piece of this will be, if we go through it, there's no journey of simplification, of greater transparency. With the wrong communications of that, it could seem like it's more bureaucracy. So there'll be a very important communication and education piece about, if you want to be sort of glib about it, doing business with public service. If we're going to get more people to compete, if if we're going to get people to come and work in the service, it's as much about communications and image as it is sometimes about the policy frameworks.
And that leads me neatly on to my last one, hopefully for now. So to what extent were the changes made since 2020 designed and implemented in collaboration with all relevant stakeholders as opposed to being imposed upon them? And I think what's crucial in this is that the stakeholders who are not currently inside the tent but who need that extra support or encouragement to come inside. I'm also touching on the point you made earlier, Michael, in relation to performance of the contracts, because I have found winning a public contract is challenging, and I have some direct experience of this. Winning the contract in itself is challenging, but can be done. But often in the performance of the contract, not in terms of getting the contract delivered, but in terms of the business getting the value out of the contract that was flagged up. Just with inertia or a company, there's almost a sense at times where people just wait till the next tender, till their preferred contractor comes back on the list. So how have you engaged with stakeholders to ensure, and I include the FSB, by the way, in this, as those small business where they can do collaborations, how has that engagement been managed?
Yeah, important to say we've made sure that any changes in the political circumstances haven't hampered that, so we have continued a full level of engagement with, be it the stakeholders across those business organisations, but also in terms of our conversations that we have with our local government colleagues, our heads of procurement meetings that we have. So we're trying to make sure that we continue to have as proactive a consultation process as we can, keeping all of the stakeholders fully involved about what's happening in terms of reviews, procurement boards, etc. But one of the things that remains a challenge, and I don't have an answer to this, I'm afraid, is trying to make sure that we get to all those people who do feel frustrated and excluded. Not all are members of organisations, and that requires a rather more sophisticated communications approach where we need very close collaboration with, for example, our local government partners, even though it may be about talking about central government contracts, not local government ones. So I think it is something that there's work to do on, because the communication network can become a little bit too narrow. And I know each of those organisations, and very encouragingly, have each been driving up their membership numbers, which remains really important as well, because it's very difficult for us to be able to respond to every query or every question. So very important will be the communication of what the new strategy is, and that communique about being easy to do business with.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John Stewart, Emily.
Thank you very much. I'd be glad to know I think I'm probably the last, so thank you for your patience and indulgence and answers so far. Just want to pick up firstly before my three official questions on Diane's point regarding timeliness of payments. I mean, I know there's a bit of a discrepancy between what the FSB have said and, Michael, I think what you think that we're at, but I do find it lamentable that any government department can't pay small, medium-sized businesses on time. There is no cash flow issue here, so I can't get my head around how it could possibly be the case, even if it's only 3 or 4%. That's still a significant chunk, and it would be really good to get a breakdown, even after this, in writing about why and where those issues are happening. I can tell you in local government, the frustrations I get from micro businesses who just can't get paid even £300 or £400 at times for weeks or months on end just seems to me totally ridiculous. I'm interested to see if we could get that breakdown.
Yeah, we'll certainly get that data, and I'm sure, I've no doubts that data is correct. It's just in terms of, we can give you the latest data, what refers to central government, and maybe give you a little bit of a flavour of why some of those sometimes disagreements over invoices or prices or something like that. So or technology issues, etc. So we'll certainly come back to you on that.
Thanks, Mike. To tease a point, you just said that you felt that it might have been further down the chain. Is that the subcontractors necessarily weren't passing it on to further subcontractors potentially?
Exactly. Yeah, I think there was an issue. I remember back, I know it was 2 years ago when I was speaking to the FSB about it. And you're quite right that NICS department's prompt payment is very, very high. It's over 90%. There's always the odd disputed invoice. We benefit there because of the automation of Account NI, which the purchase order set up. So when the invoice arrives, it's a straight match and it's out the door if it's approved. There's no interaction. Once you move out of the NICS, I mean, I know that Health Service have a fairly good payment system in their accounting system. Education should be the same. When you get into local authority, I have no experience of what their accounting system, how much automation there is at the invoice, and you can't get cases where invoice has come in on paper and lost on somebody's desk and didn't go anywhere. There is a percentage of invoices that will always be disputed, as Neil said, because the supplier has put it in wrong, he's put in an incorrect amount. That can upset it. So I think what I was trying to say is that we have a high percentage at around 95%. but there will always be a number of invoices that are disputed for some reason or other, and it could be an error in the invoice, something like that.
Yeah, it could be at our end, it could be a number doesn't match the number we were expecting. We have to be very careful with our rules to make sure that we're only paying for work done, not work on account. So there's some very particular, and sometimes you have to query an invoice. So there always will be, but it's a totally fair question, and we'll make sure we get you the updated figures.
Thank you. In terms of, I think we all welcome the fact that 20% goes to small and micro businesses here, that 2/3 of turnover or of procurement funding goes to Northern Ireland based businesses, I think you said, Neil, as well.
Yeah, it's where their registered office is, so it's probably an undercount because some of the businesses who are not registered here may well have a presence here, so it's not a precise figure, that sort of roughly 2/3, and it's about 20% is with micro.
It would be interesting to get that figure because my focus would be how do we get 3/3 of it coming to Northern Ireland companies from a purely selfish Northern Ireland first process. How do we get as much as possible? So just to tease that out, is the majority of contracts that don't get awarded to Northern Ireland businesses because they can't fulfil the contract, or because people from outside Northern Ireland are tendering in a more beneficial way to win it?
It's a mix. There are some that are very specialist, and there are very few companies that supply. There is the example we've also heard of that, to be honest, there are a number of certain services and goods that the biggest profits wouldn't be in providing to public sector, and many firms outgrow and go into different markets, and they're more interested in an export market, or they have a different client, and there may not be an easy backfill for that locally, so there might be a gap in the market, which might take time to fill. So there's always a sense in which the successful elsewhere, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it then requires your local businesses to meet that level of competition and say, well, if I'm going to win that, I need to be better than that. And then there are some things around software licenses and all sorts of other procurement that we simply don't provide locally, or materials that are just not produced. So there is an element of, it's a sort of mixed bag of why that's the case. And I don't think we would ever get to that sort of 3/3 point simply for that reason. There may be materials, products or services that we need that would never be feasible to produce locally. It could be a design of a software solution, or it could be something of a particular material or component that's needed that wouldn't be sourced locally. So we think it's really important, though, to just encourage more people to be wanting to sell to. And that goes back to the point about making sure that we're very clear about how easy and easier we are getting to do business with, and also positive news stories from other businesses who can do that almost advertising for us, if you will.
Okay. In terms of implementing, you've talked about the new practices that have been implemented in the change. Is there any significant resistance to any of those new practices from any COPE or significant authorities or external suppliers that you can think of, and how they be overcome?
I don't get involved in all of the detailed conversations, so colleagues will speak better to this, but actually I would say, going back to that, I think our openness and transparency has meant there's been some very frank conversations about some of the more complex changes that we've looked to. I would say the greatest restriction comes out of the fact that we have skills shortages. So anything that when we're engaging with COPEs or indeed suppliers and we're asking for more material, they're saying we're on our knees, we don't have the staff, and you're asking for more. So that's why we have to be very particular about what it is that we ask. So if we've had any sort of disagreements or difficulties in collating, it's been more to do with that we simply don't have the resources, or we've a different payment system, so we can't get the data in that way. But in terms of any of the policy direction, there's been very frank and detailed debate and conversation. But I would say, certainly in my experience, we've had a very open, since the Minister's been in post, very keen to meet the organisations who've wanted to meet with her. You've certainly continued to do that during the period when... So I think any form of change, and there will definitely be nervousness about the new Procurement Act and what that means. So there's a strong requirement on us to have a very proactive engagement and stakeholder engagement period over the coming months, because that probably is the biggest change in procurement in a very long time, and that'll create its own level of nervousness amongst organisations. So really important. A good example, when we had that period of our systems being down for updates, we had, there was a little bit of critique there, and we were very quick to engage fully with the FSB, and we developed, I think, a very good working relationship there about getting them to help communicate for us why it was happening and how quickly we were doing it and why it needed to happen, because they have a level of communication with business that we'll never be able to reach. So absolutely, there are areas of disagreement, no doubt about that, but I would say there is we had nervousness over the construction toolkits coming in, but actually I would say on the main, it's a healthy discussion.
that leads me to my next question then, in terms of the implications arising from, but you've touched on this, I think you all have, about what the implications will be for the Procurement Act. Can you summarise maybe just in a couple of points what you think the impact will be, and further to that, what work's been done to prep both public bodies and suppliers for any of the upcoming changes?
Yeah, I'll let Michael speak to that. That's been an important area for us. It's hugely, I can't understate, it's a kind of, I don't want to say perfect storm because that's a bad analogy, but there's yes, give me something nicer than that, Michael. Yeah, I haven't drunk. My 7 litres of water have drained me of my creative mind. But actually, I think we have a real coming together of factors here with a new potential strategic direction programme for government, executive back. At the very time the new act's coming in, it is substantive, and without the right communication and without us doing the engagement, there would be a nervousness about that. So you can speak about the training we've been doing, the engagement we've been doing to get both the COPs ready and talk to stakeholders.
Yeah, we have been engaging since November last year on it, as soon as it was published. So we've had a number of webinars, but it is a lot of the information that's gone out has been managed by Cabinet Office because we want to keep a consistent message to suppliers in all the jurisdictions, and we've done that consistently. It's been out there on e-tenders NI. We have the facility to shoot messages out to all suppliers who register, which is up to about 37,000 at the minute. Okay, so we're constantly updating them. It is up to the supplier how much they take into that. We will be doing a further more targeted programme of engagement because we are working with the final pieces of the digital technology to support the Act. This is where all these transparency notices will go, all the data will go. And at that point, then we are also changing e-tenders NI functionality. Okay, and at that point, when we're clear on what's final position is, we want to go to suppliers to tell them this is exactly the changes that you will see. You may need to go and get a new ID number from this new portal. You may need to pump that into e-tenders NI. There's a couple of other bits and pieces around that. Changes wise, apart from those registration and numbers, the big change that the suppliers will see is that they will have a portal to store an awful lot of information that's consistently asked to provide during procurement processes to right across any public sector body. They will be able to store that information in this new database and just actually give it to any authority that asks for it without having to do very much. Apart from that, suppliers will not see significant change because their elements of procurement will remain the same. They will be asked to provide the authority with some level of information and give us a price and put it in a secure electronic envelope. That will remain the same. The changes on the public sector side are probably more beneficial to supplier because I have felt, and Sharon, you hopefully would support this, is that suppliers have felt that we don't engage enough with them during the procurement process. The new Procurement Act will give us the flexibility to be able to engage in a lot of different ways and run procurement processes in a lot of different ways to suit different markets and different levels of engagement. And I hope suppliers will see the benefit of that, of being able to give us a better prepared tender offer, a more commercially focused offer, and actually going into the contract, more aware of what you're being asked to deliver. And I would see the benefits coming in it in that way. But the communication side, we will be given the targeted communication in around the end of June.
Okay. That's reassuring because I think for a lot of micro businesses particularly, there's a fear factor out there. They look at some of the documents and think, do you know what, that's just too much effort. They've enough going on. So, and then they maybe get used to a system and then they see something new come in and think, not again. But for the most part, it sounds like it's not going to be.
There's one thing in this new regulations that wasn't in the other, and it's to have regard for SMEs, and that's now a legislative duty on contracting authorities. And that means if you are coming up with something complex, you really need to consider how long will it take an SME or micro business to complete this tender. Someone who has a bid team and who has all the resources available to them at that time could do it a lot quicker than an SME potentially. So that to me changes the differential between treating everybody the same and making sure that you now have a legal duty to regard SMEs, and if you perceive any barriers, then you have a duty to minimise those barriers. And I think that's a really clear signal that this set of new regulations, it also talks about maximising public benefit, again wasn't in the old regime, it's on this regime. So I think the duty is on us as procurement professionals to make it a difference and to make sure that SMEs and micro businesses do see the difference.
I think that's the key, Chair, particularly we're an economy that's 99.5% small, micro and medium-sized enterprises, so it would make sense that we have a procurement system that tailors to their needs, so it's reassuring. The final point, Chair, if I may, is just obviously no one does anything perfectly, and I think just interested to hear what's being done to monitor other areas around the world or in these areas about best practice and what we can learn from other areas and how we track that.
Yeah, very important that we do that, and important that we do it. We're looking at other jurisdictions and we've regular engagement, but it's also looking at what's proportionate to us, with the size of a sort of county council in some senses. So it's not always large jurisdictions that are the best comparator for us, and that's why we need our own flexibilities and we have our own provisions. And as you've already alluded to, that we make sure that the system works specifically for a place of this size and this structure. So we are trying to make sure we don't reinvent the wheel where we don't have to, try to use existing systems and existing expertise where we can, but very cognizant of our own methodologies. So we have regular engagements with our colleagues, close engagement with Cabinet Office, close engagements with other jurisdictions, close engagements with local government. So we're continuing to make sure that we keep that up. But also not be afraid of being the leader as well. It's not always that just if it's someone else has done it, it'll be okay. Place is unique, so there are ways in which we need to tailor our offers in a very unique way.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, John. You've been quite optimistic about the various changes and improvements that you expect to see, but how are you going to measure these to ensure that they're successful?
Yeah, I think you have to be optimistic in this job, but it goes back to that transparency and reporting point. This will be a wholesale look at what sort of board is required, what governance and accountability, what type of reporting can be in place. That will give us information that we didn't have before to allow us to do that. And I think being able to have a more empirical based system will allow me to be able to see across the system a little bit better than we can do currently. But also we have a very engaged profession. One of the things that you get when you have a lot of vacancies and problems is people really feel a sort of sense of camaraderie and stuff. So there is actually a little bit of enthusiasm for there's going to be new structures, there's going to be new ways of doing this. Can we do anything now to make it a little bit easier? And we've got strong engagement with the new subcommittee of the board. So I think there is significantly reasons to be optimistic. I think the reasons I do so is because of that bringing together of a load of factors at the one time. I think it was just the act. I think when that's coming in alongside a new strategic direction, that kind of rebuilds the enthusiasm across the sector, because you can start to put out new documents, new materials, and say to people, look, we're easier to do business with and we are an attractive place to come and work. And that's the two priorities for me as accounting officer.
Okay. Briefly, we have Diane and then Colin, and then that'll conclude.
Yep, thank you. And I just wanted to build on a question there John had asked. Michael, you were responding. So it's around when the new legislation comes in and the communication of the new tenders, and you were addressing the steps you take to communicate with the bodies and the existing suppliers. I wanted to ask, have you taken any steps around planning for communications with people who aren't existing suppliers? So we'll refer back to my point that I was making before about the perception of it being a closed shop. So have you prepared any communication, or will you be, to say we are doing something new, it's easier, it's more accessible, it's open to everyone, just to make those that feel that they can't use the current system for whatever reason know that you're doing something a little bit different now? And if not, I would encourage that you would consider that.
Yeah, it's a fair point. We do our best in this when we have a, working with Wales and England on this. We do have a huge email push out of that system. Every time an update comes, it's sent to anybody that's registered. We're encouraging the registration system. It's just when I said about pushing through e-tenders, that's my main medium for suppliers. I've got 35,000 registered there. We've had a programme over the last 9 years of been out with our other partner groups like Intertrade Ireland and everybody, pushing everybody to register, even if you're not interested, because e-tenders is designed to send an alert out to a company every time a tender gets published against a certain code. So I think that's why we've got 35,000. But we also have other organisations such as Intertrade Ireland doing some of the work for us there to communicate out there as well. But outside of that, there isn't a medium where we can get to potential suppliers that may be interested but are never expressed an interest with us before. We don't have that sort of
Would you
medium.
consider a wider communications piece as a one-off, as kind of what I'm saying? Because if there was anything available, I would happily push it out and boost it in my own locality. It's just, I think when you're doing something new like this, we need to think about how this is, you know, going to be communicated, to just put a positive spin on it and open the door to those small and medium-sized businesses. Again, I just always refer back to South Down and just the rural area that maybe isn't linking directly in with a lot of the organisations that you're mentioning that aren't registered on these email chains, and then they feel that they don't have that chain. But if there's anything that we can do as elected reps, or just a wider comms piece to say we're doing something new, please get involved. You know, you can access these services too, because coming back to my point on the likes of the sellotapes, we get this often. We get it with gardening services in our local schools. We've local providers who don't know how to get onto the system. So if there's anything that we can do in terms of comms as we move forward to a new system, Cal's laughing at me because I'm always
I can see the last paragraph of our report, Chair. I can see it.
I just want to make
if there isn't the
the
sellotape
picture
on the front cover, I'd be shocked.
I just want to, you know, just take the opportunity to say I think we have a really good opportunity here to reach out to new potential people, to get better value for money for public spend, to open the door to people who can deliver, you know, good quality services on a local level.
I think just to pop in that one point, Colin, if we did, the key organisation to me is Enterprise NI. They represent all the local enterprise agencies, over 100,000 small, medium enterprises. So if something could be fed through them, I think that would be really worthwhile.
We take absolutely very good suggestion, and we on all the FSBs to enterprise it. We will certainly make sure once we get things working good, slick, we'll
get there.
Thank you, Colin. And then
and this occurred to me when John was asking his question. It's about horizon scanning. So John was talking about other jurisdictions. Are we scanning the horizon in terms of emerging technologies and their potential to be disruptive, either positively or negatively? So AI is the obvious one, but quantum computing, are we looking at all of those now at the present time?
Yeah, particularly with the artificial intelligence, it's something that has been raised over the last year with all the administrations coming together. We have what's called a common framework agreement with all the nations come together to discuss policy emergence. AI particularly has been a concern in procurement because we know that there is the capacity for authorities to put tender documents out there and for companies to use artificial intelligence to identify the perfect answer. Cabinet Office have recently published a policy on this to ensure that tendering organisations are asked to confirm any software that's been used to develop the answer and how much of the response has been AI generated so that they can become aware of it. And I think we will have to do something similar on that here. I mean, I know that Sharon will probably say a bit more on it, but we actually probably have a little bit of that going on without AI, where you have bid writers trying to help small businesses out and actually selling some parts of tender responses through different organisations, and the next thing you get tender responses in with similar looking answers as well. But on the technology front, that's one aspect. The other aspect that I'm looking at, Sharon touched on recently, is about a future replacement for our current e-tendering system, and we know that we're watching the market very carefully in that. And I think from the analysis that we've done with the other jurisdictions in the last couple of months, is we're actually down to about 3 systems because one of them has actually pulled out of our market.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, members, I'm conscious of time. You've been extremely... Is this one sentence?
Because you let us out then in perpetuity. No, the point, 2 comments I want to make. I mean, the staffing issue is a big issue, Neil, and we need to look at it right across the board. But the other one I wanted to ask, Sharon, you said have regard for small and medium. Now, does it say must have or may have, or is it just a duty to have regard in the legislation?
It's a must. And
it's a must, isn't it?
Shall, yeah, which is a must.
You'll actually have to, if you haven't taken due regard, you will have to state in the notice what action you've taken or haven't taken.
It's vitally important. I mean, it's vitally important more than we think.
Thanks, Cal.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We're nearly done. You'll be glad to know you've taken questions from us for just over two and a half hours. So thanks very much for your patience and for answering many of the questions. CNAG, have you any points you'd like to raise? No? Sure.
One brief comment, sir, just I think in relation to line of question earlier from Mr. Buchanan. I think Mr. Buchanan talked about getting contracts to come in within price. I think it's a slightly different lens, but I think it's important to reflect for the committee just around the Department of Finance's role in approving all expenditure, and in particular the outline business case that Ms Forsyth talked about as a supplementary point to yours. You know, there's a standard condition of approval with DOF of 10% within the cost set out within that outline business case, and that's a long-standing convention. And I always think that's an attempt to kind of keep control. And if a project is spiralling beyond that 10%, that approval falls, and the department in question have to produce an addendum explaining why the cost has risen, and then to reflect if that's still the recommended option is still the best value for money case. So I always think that's an important control that we don't lose sight of as well. So hopefully that reassures members of some of the controls that are in place. You know.
Thank you, Stuart. Neil, Sharon and Michael, thanks very much, and thanks for enduring the heat. Not just
bill me for the water.
Not just in the room, but also from the members, and also for taking questions. We do appreciate your time. We know you're extremely busy, and I sincerely hope that in a number of months, or certainly in the very near future, I can share the optimism you have, because if all of the things you say you're going to do happens, we will have a great system at the end of it. So I'm very hopeful that there will be positive change that can be easily identified and measured. So thanks very much for being with us. We do deeply appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, members. Appreciate it.
I think it's important just as well at this point that we put on record our sincere appreciation to the Controller and Auditor General and the Northern Ireland Audit Office staff and team, and also Stuart and the team, his team as well, for the work and the help and assistance that we've had to date. Members, if agreed, we'll now move into closed session briefly. Right.
Committee Room 21. Sound. Committee Room 21. Sound. Committee Room 21. Sound. Committee Room 21. Sound.